The Boarding House. The Dorothea Puente Case. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. Some houses become stories. Not because they are old or beautiful or architecturally unusual, but because they hold a particular kind of silence, the kind that forms when people vanish and the world does not ask loudly enough where they went. In such cases, the truth is not hidden by mystery. It is hidden by ordinary assumptions, that the missing have simply moved on, that the vulnerable are difficult, that the poor are unreliable, that the lonely have no witnesses. A boarding house is designed to be temporary. People arrive with suitcases and debts, with illness, with hope, with nowhere else to go. They rent a room and try to stabilize their lives. They depend on the small structure the house provides, a bed, a key, an address, a place to belong however briefly. A boarding house offers shelter, but it also offers invisibility. Tenants come and go, and the outside world grows accustomed to turnover. A person can disappear without sounding an alarm, not because nobody cares, but because the system has trained everyone to accept disappearance as normal. This is the environment in which Dorothea Puente became more than a landlady. Her story is not simply the story of a woman who killed. It is the story of how a particular kind of crime becomes possible when vulnerability is treated as background noise. It is the story of how caretaking can be weaponized, how bureaucracy can be exploited, and how a familiar persona can convince a neighborhood, a city, and multiple agencies to look away. It is also a story of a house. A Victorian-style property on F Street in Sacramento presented itself as refuge. It offered rooms to those who needed them. It offered a steady hand, a warm voice, a sense of domestic order. It looked from the outside like the kind of place where people could be safe. That appearance mattered. It shaped trust. It shaped assumptions. It shaped the long delay between suspicion and intervention. This book follows the case chronologically, not in the order the legend prefers, but in the order the lives unfolded. It begins not with bodies in the yard, but with the conditions that allowed bodies to be hidden there. It begins with the persona of a landlady who appeared generous and maternal, and with the kinds of tenants who were easiest to overlook once they were inside her walls. It traces the quiet patterns of disappearance and the slow building pressure of questions that were dismissed until they became impossible to ignore. In writing about Dorothea Puente, restraint is necessary. The case is often told as spectacle: the death house landlady, the backyard grave, the shocking contrast between grandmotherly appearance and violent outcome. These elements draw attention because they are dramatic. They also risk turning the victims into background props in a story about a villain. This manuscript refuses that arrangement. The victims are not included here as numbers. They are included as people who were vulnerable, who were exploited, and whose disappearance was permitted by a system that did not protect them. The tone of this book reflects that aim. It is written without sensationalism and without romanticizing violence. It does not treat murder as entertainment. It treats it as harm that occurred not only through acts of killing, but through the long neglect that made those acts possible. It also draws a careful boundary between documented record and cultural myth. Some details of this case are clear: arrests, discoveries, convictions, sentences. Other details exist in the haze where true crime and media storytelling intersect: disputed claims, exaggerated numbers, public perception shaped by headlines. This book distinguishes between what can be supported by evidence and what has become part of a larger narrative about the killer landlady. Where facts can be stated cleanly, they are stated cleanly. Where claims exist without secure confirmation, they are treated as claims. This approach is not cautious for the sake of politeness. It is cautious because truth demands it. A crime can be horrifying without being embellished. In fact, the more closely this case is examined, the more unsettling it becomes, not because it requires Gothic invention, but because it reveals how easily a person can be swallowed by a system that treats them as disposable. The house on F Street did not operate in isolation. It operated within the gaps of social services, the blind spots of bureaucracy, the reluctance of communities to suspect a caretaker, and the human tendency to assume that what looks safe must be safe. In the end, this is not only a story about a murderer. It is a story about who is easy to kill. And why. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Learned to Disappear. Dorothea Puente was not born a landlady. Long before the boarding house on F Street became a graveyard, there was a girl in Southern California whose life began in instability and ended up shaped by it. Her story, even at the level of basic biography, is difficult to hold steady. Part of this is the nature of her childhood, fragmented, poorly protected, and not recorded with care. Part of it is Dorothea herself. In later life, she was known to lie, to reinvent details, to offer conflicting accounts, and to restage her own history as though it were a costume she could change when needed. What can be said with confidence is that she was born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California, in San Bernardino County. She came into a large family. Sources differ slightly on the number of siblings, some state 6, some 7, but all agree it was a crowded household, and it was not a safe one. Her parents are most often identified as Jesse James Gray and Trudy May, reported under different surnames in different accounts, and the most consistent descriptions of the home painted as chaotic, marked by alcoholism, volatility, and poverty. The details of her early home life are grim in a way that later true crime often treats as foreshadowing, but the reality is less neat than that. A damaged childhood does not create a murderer on its own, and many people endure terrible beginnings without harming others. Still, Dorothea's early years were defined by the kind of instability that teaches a child one primary lesson: survival depends on adaptation. Her father died when she was still young, commonly reported as tuberculosis, around 1937, when she was 8 years old. The loss was not merely emotional. In families already struggling, the death of a parent often means the collapse of what little structure existed. After that, Dorothea's mother lost custody of the children. Accounts differ in the specific reasons and timing, but the end result remains the same: the family split, and the children were sent into institutional care. Dorothea and her siblings were placed in an orphanage, where later reports state she was sexually abused. In a world where vulnerable children were often treated as invisible, this was not uncommon. It was, however, formative. A child who learns early that adults can be dangerous, that authority can harm rather than protect, and that institutions can swallow people whole, learns to survive through performance. Politeness becomes armor. Charm becomes currency. Lying becomes strategy. This is the soil in which Dorothea's later persona would grow. The record is thin on her schooling. There is little to suggest a stable education, and nothing that indicates an ordinary adolescence with predictable milestones. What appears instead is a pattern of early adult behavior shaped by drifting, improvisation, and short-lived roles. Some later accounts describe her leaving home young and moving through unstable work. Whatever the precise sequence, by her mid-teens she was already stepping into adult life without protection. At 16, Dorothea married. In 1945, she became the wife of Fred McFall, a soldier recently returned from the Pacific Theater after the Second World War. It was not unusual for girls to marry young in that era, particularly those with few options and little family support. Marriage could appear to offer stability. It could also offer escape. Dorothea's marriage produced children, but not a conventional family life. 2 daughters were born in the years after the wedding, and yet neither child remained with her in the way a typical maternal narrative would suggest. One was sent to live with relatives, and the other was placed for adoption. She also suffered a miscarriage. This pattern, pregnancy, loss, separation, does not confirm motive or diagnosis. But it does show a life in which people did not stay. Dorothea's relationship with legality also began early. In 1948, while still very young, she was arrested for using forged checks to purchase women's accessories. It is an important early detail because it establishes a consistent behavior that would later become central to her crimes: deception for material gain, executed through paperwork. Fraud is often treated as a lesser crime than violence, but in many serial cases it is the scaffolding. It is the practice ground for taking without being seen. It teaches manipulation. It teaches risk management. It teaches the ability to present a respectable face while living in contradiction beneath it. Over the following decades, Dorothea's life expanded into a series of relationships and reinventions. She married multiple times. She changed surnames. She shifted between roles. Later reports frequently note that she was a prolific liar about her past, offering versions of herself that suited the situation, a pattern that suggests not only dishonesty, but a deeper instinct, identity as a tool. One of her later marriages, to Roberto Puente, contributed to the name by which she would be known publicly. She kept Puente, even after the marriage ended, and her association with Hispanic culture became part of her outward identity. She was described later as cooking, offering food to neighbors, and presenting herself as a warm caretaker figure, a persona that would become central in Sacramento. This is where the story begins to sharpen into its recognizable shape. By the time Dorothea Puente became a landlady, she had already spent a lifetime learning the value of appearance. Childhood had taught her that safety could be performative. Adulthood had taught her that paperwork could be manipulated. Relationships had taught her that people could be useful, temporary, replaceable. And once she had a house of her own, she would find a way to turn those lessons into a system. A boarding house is a place built for strangers. That is what makes it dangerous in the hands of someone who understands how to make strangers vanish. Chapter 2: The Mask of the Landlady. A boarding house does not announce what it is. From the street, it can look like any other home: a porch, a tidy front garden, curtains drawn against the afternoon glare. It can smell like cooking and furniture polish. It can present itself as a place of small domestic order, a refuge for those who have had enough of sleeping rough, couch surfing, or being moved through institutions that never feel like care. This is what Dorothea Puente offered. By the time she settled into Sacramento and took control of a boarding house, she was no longer a young woman with a fractured childhood and a string of reinventions. She was older, practiced, and unusually skilled at performing what people wanted to believe. Her outward identity was not built to alarm. It was built to reassure. She cultivated warmth. Neighbors later described a woman who appeared maternal, attentive, and involved. She could be generous with food. She could speak gently. She could present herself as someone who understood hardship and wanted to help. This mattered, because many of the people who had come to live in her house were desperate for exactly that: a steady figure, a predictable environment, and a sense that someone was paying attention. The landlady role suited her perfectly. It placed her in a position of authority that did not look like authority. A landlord sounds powerful. A landlady sounds domestic. The difference is cultural, not legal, but cultural differences shape perception. People expect danger from a man who controls property. They often fail to expect it from a woman who offers tea, warmth, and a spare room. The boarding house itself became part of the disguise. It carried a certain moral neutrality. It was not a bar. It was not a back alley establishment. It was not an institution with a reputation. It was a house, the kind of place that suggests automatically that someone is home. To understand how Puente's crimes later became possible, the mask must be understood first. The mask was not only her personality. It was the role she played in the local ecosystem of vulnerability. Boarding houses tend to serve people who have few choices. Elderly people living on benefits. Men with disabilities. People with mental illness. People whose families are distant or fractured. People who are easily moved through systems and easily lost inside them. Many of Puente's future tenants belonged to these categories, and that was not incidental. It was a prerequisite. The mask worked because it promised safety to people who had none. Puente's house offered structure, meals, a bed, a room with a door that could close. In exchange, it required trust, and more importantly, it required access. A landlord needs paperwork. A landlord needs identification. A landlord needs benefit information if rent is paid through checks. A landlord needs signatures. A landlord needs proximity. This is where caretaking and control blur. For vulnerable tenants, assistance often comes bundled with intrusion. Help means someone knows where the money comes from. Help means someone knows which medications are taken. Help means someone knows the vulnerabilities that can be exploited: poor vision, confusion, isolation, dependence. Help also means someone can decide who is allowed into the house and who is kept out. The boarding house becomes a controlled environment, and the landlady becomes gatekeeper. A gatekeeper can be protective. A gatekeeper can also become predatory. What made Puente's mask particularly effective was its alignment with a social expectation that an older woman who appears maternal is fundamentally harmless. This expectation is so strong that it can override warning signs. When neighbors see strangers coming and going, they assume it is simply tenants. When a tenant disappears, they assume he has moved on. When an older woman offers a simple explanation, he left to live with family, he went into hospital, he moved away, people accept it because acceptance is easier than suspicion. Suspicion requires confrontation. Confrontation is uncomfortable. In a neighborhood, discomfort is often avoided until it becomes unavoidable. Puente also benefited from the invisibility of her tenants. Many were not socially anchored. Their lives were not threaded into wide networks of people who would immediately notice their absence. They were not the kind of individuals whose disappearance would make headlines. They were, in the cold logic of systems, the kind of people who could be lost slowly. This is not only about individual neglect. It is about institutional habit. Social services, disability support, welfare systems, these structures are overwhelmed and under-resourced even in the best of circumstances. They run on paperwork and compliance. People who miss appointments are often assumed to be unstable rather than endangered. People who vanish can be treated as non-compliant rather than missing. When a case involves vulnerable adults, the system can mistakenly interpret disappearance as choice. This is one reason boarding house crimes are so effective. They hide inside assumptions. Puente understood those assumptions. She also understood that every tenant represented not only rent, but a source of continuing income. Boarding houses operate on a churn. Rooms fill, rooms empty, rooms fill again. The turnover can be constant. In such a system, a new tenant does not raise questions. It is normal. A landlady who is always finding someone to fill a room appears industrious rather than suspicious. A house that always has someone moving in appears needed rather than dangerous. There was another advantage: a boarding house is rarely inspected closely. Unlike hospitals, care facilities, or formal institutions, boarding houses can slip beneath certain kinds of scrutiny. They exist in a gray zone: private property, semi-commercial, semi-domestic. Unless there are direct complaints or clear evidence of harm, authorities often have limited cause to intervene. A landlady can therefore operate for long periods with minimal oversight, especially if she appears stable and cooperative. Puente's mask included cooperation. A person who understands systems learns when to charm, when to comply, and when to obscure. Small lies become routine. Stories are told confidently. Explanations are delivered with the calm assurance of someone who belongs. The more unremarkable a person appears, the easier it becomes for them to guide what others believe. This is the quiet genius of the landlady role. It is socially invisible power. And it is especially potent when it is applied to people whose lives are already half invisible. By the time the public learned Dorothea Puente's name, she was spoken about as though she had been a monster hiding in plain sight. The truth is more unsettling. She was not hiding at all. She was performing. The performance was tailored to the culture around her. An older woman who cooks. An older woman who takes in people who need help. An older woman who seems like a harmless fixture in the community. The house becomes an extension of that image, a place where the vulnerable are supposedly safe because someone is looking after them. This is what makes the later revelations so horrifying. Because the mask was not an afterthought. It was the method. Chapter 3: The People Who Moved In. The house on F Street did not look like a hunting ground. It looked like a place where people could land softly. It offered meals, a bed, and the promise of stability for those who had spent years moving through systems that treated them as paperwork rather than human beings. It offered rooms to the elderly, the unwell, the isolated, the mentally ill, and the poor, the kinds of people who are often described as at risk, as though risk is a natural weather pattern rather than something created by neglect. When Dorothea Puente began taking in boarders, she did not need to build a trap from scratch. The world had already built it. She only needed to recognize how it worked. The people who moved into her boarding house were not anonymous to those who loved them, but they were easy to make anonymous to institutions. Many lived on government benefits. Many had disabilities. Many did not have the social structure that forces immediate questions when someone stops answering the phone. In a house like this, disappearances could be disguised as ordinary turnover. A tenant moved on. A tenant went into hospital. A tenant returned to family. A tenant relapsed. A tenant vanished into the long, quiet churn of the vulnerable. That is how the pattern began. A truth-first account of Puente's victims must distinguish between three categories: those she was convicted of murdering, those she was charged with murdering, and those who were widely considered victims based on evidence but never legally resolved through conviction. The criminal case itself reflected the difficulty of prosecuting a pattern built on forgotten people. Jurors convicted her of 3 murders and deadlocked on other counts. Even so, the names remain. The victims did not simply disappear. They were taken. Ruth Montero, Monroe, 61, April 1982. One of the earliest deaths connected to Puente is Ruth Montero, often spelled Monroe, aged 61, who died on April 28, 1982. She had visited Puente's home in the weeks prior and was later found dead from respiratory depression caused by a massive overdose of codeine. At the time, the death was not immediately treated as murder. Later, it was classified as a homicide. In the early phase of this story, that delay matters. It shows the environment in which Puente could operate, a world where the overdose of a vulnerable person could be explained away as misadventure, despair, or accident. Everson Gilmouth, 77, 1982. Everson Gilmouth, aged 77, is frequently listed among Puente's victims. He was one of her boarders, and he was dead by 1982. His death became part of the wider case later, though the legal handling of individual counts was complicated by timing, procedural issues, and limits within the prosecution. Gilmouth's name is important because it illustrates the long arc of Puente's offending. The pattern begins earlier than many assume, and it persists for years before it is properly confronted. Leona Carpenter, 78, October 1986, convicted. Leona Carpenter, aged 78, became one of the 3 murders Puente was ultimately convicted of. In October 1986, Puente was connected to legal and financial maneuvers surrounding Carpenter while she was vulnerable. She had suffered an overdose of flurazepam, and Puente was present during arrangements that gave Puente access to her affairs. Carpenter's inclusion in the conviction underscores what the state could prove, not merely death, but a chain of financial exploitation tied to the disappearance of a person inside Puente's orbit. Betty Mae Palmer, 78, late 1986, found, charged. Betty Mae Palmer, aged 78, arrived at Puente's boarding house in the fall of 1986. Puente obtained identification using Palmer's name while using Puente's own photograph. Palmer's benefits were redirected to Puente's address, and nearly $7,000 in payments were stolen. In November 1988, as police excavated the yard, a partially dismembered body was found. The missing head, hands, and lower legs meant the identification process took time. The remains were identified as Palmer's in January 1989 through medical X-ray comparison. Palmer's case became one of the most visually shocking aspects of the investigation, but the true horror is quieter. She was a vulnerable older woman, and the system that was meant to protect her finances became part of the method used against her. Vera Faye Martin, 61, October 1987. Vera Faye Martin, aged 61, was sent to live with Puente in early October 1987. Within days, Puente began forging her Social Security checks, eventually totaling thousands of dollars. Martin failed to contact her daughter on her birthday, a detail that reflects what makes disappearance real, not paperwork, but broken routine. When the yard was searched in November 1988, Martin's body was found buried beneath a metal shed. Toxicology later revealed the presence of sedative medication in her system. Dorothy Miller, 65, October/November 1987, convicted. Dorothy Miller, aged 65, was placed into Puente's home in October 1987. Within weeks she was gone. After her disappearance, Puente hired a carpet cleaner to remove a foul-smelling mess from Miller's room, a domestic detail that becomes chilling in retrospect because it is so ordinary. Miller became one of the 3 murders Puente was convicted of. Alvaro Bert Montoya, 51, 1988. Alvaro Bert Montoya, aged 51, is among the best known of Puente's victims. He was one of her tenants and one of the bodies found on the property in 1988. Montoya's name appears repeatedly in accounts because his disappearance was part of the investigative momentum that finally tipped into excavation and arrest. Benjamin Fink, 55, March/April 1988, convicted. Benjamin Fink, aged 55, moved into Puente's house on March 9, 1988. His brother visited weekly, and then within weeks, Fink was simply gone. Another tenant reported a foul smell from his room. Puente blamed plumbing and sewer issues. Soon after, she received bags of cement and had a hole dug near the metal shed, later covered with concrete. When police later dug up the yard, Fink's body was discovered wrapped in bedding and plastic, secured with tape, and concealed carefully. Toxicology reports indicated sedative and psychiatric drugs. Fink became one of the 3 murders Puente was convicted of. James Gallup, 62, 1988. James Gallup, aged 62, is listed among the known victims whose remains were found on the property. Like others, he was a boarder, and his death became part of the wider pattern of tenants who entered the house and never emerged. Suspected or debated victims. Some individuals are referenced in connection to Puente without conviction or formal resolution. The best-known example is Eugene Gamel, aged 58, who died in 1987 from an apparent suicide by overdose. He was Puente's tenant, and investigators considered him a possible victim, though Puente was never charged with his murder. The existence of suspected victims is part of what makes the Puente case so unsettling. It is not only the deaths that are proven. It is the possibility of how many deaths could hide in a world that accepts the disappearance of vulnerable adults as routine. These names are often presented in true crime as a list. A list makes the story easier to process. It also strips away reality. Each victim entered Puente's house carrying a life, habits, favorite foods, family connections however strained, physical limitations, private hopes. Many relied on benefits not because they were weak, but because they had been injured, sick, or failed by systems that promised care. They were human beings seeking safety, and the thing they found instead was a landlady who understood how to turn safety into control. The crimes did not occur all at once. They were not a spree. They were a slow harvest. And for years, the world largely allowed it. Chapter 4, The System That Paid. Money is rarely loud. In cases like this, it moves quietly through envelopes, signatures, photocopies, and forms that are meant to protect people, but often end up protecting the person who knows how to manipulate them. A boarding house does not need a weapon to become dangerous. It needs access, and access is granted most easily through bureaucracy. The people who moved into Dorothea Puente's house were not, in the eyes of the state, primarily individuals. They were files. They were benefit recipients. They were names attached to payments designed to keep them housed, fed, and alive. Their survival often depended on systems that operated at a distance: social security offices, disability support, caseworkers spread thin, and postal delivery. Puente did not create these systems. She learned how to use them. A boarding house functions like a funnel. People arrive needing a room. The landlady asks for identification. She asks for paperwork. She asks how rent will be paid. For many of Puente's tenants, rent was paid by benefits. That meant checks arrived on a schedule, and those checks mattered because they were the difference between having a bed and losing one. This arrangement sounds simple, even humane. It becomes something else when the person controlling the mailbox also controls the story. The first step was location. Once a tenant was registered at the F Street address, correspondence followed. Letters arrived. Checks arrived. Notices arrived. Information meant for the tenant came to the house, and the house belonged, in practice, to the landlady. The tenant might have a room, but Puente had the keys, not only to doors, but to the flow of mail, to the narrative presented to outsiders, and to the daily rhythms of the household. The second step was trust. Many tenants, especially those with disabilities or cognitive vulnerabilities, depended on help to manage money. Even those who were fully capable might accept assistance in small ways, someone offering to post a letter, to help with a form, to explain an agency request, to keep a check safe. Once that assistance is offered, a boundary is crossed. The landlady is no longer only providing a room. She is becoming a manager. Management, in the wrong hands, becomes control. The third step was authority. Inside a boarding house, the landlady sets rules. She controls who comes in and out. She can decide whether a tenant is allowed visitors. She can decide whether a tenant's family is told the truth about what is happening. She can decide which calls are answered. She can decide what information leaves the house. This is where the system begins to pay twice, once to the intended recipient, and once to the person who has taken ownership of their identity. Puente was not simply stealing money. She was taking the machinery of the welfare state and turning it into a private income stream. Benefit checks continued to arrive. Rent continued to be paid. The paper trail continued to suggest that the tenant existed. A person can vanish while their paperwork remains alive. That is the heart of this method. A check in a mailbox does not notice that the person it is meant for is missing. An agency does not automatically suspect murder because a vulnerable adult stops showing up. A system designed to process thousands of claims and payments cannot easily detect the shape of an individual tragedy unless someone makes noise. Noise is what Puente's victims often lacked. Many had few close family members. Some had strained relationships. Some were isolated by illness. Some were limited by mobility. Some lived with mental illness. Some had simply been worn down by life until they moved through the world with the quietness of people who have learned not to ask for too much. Puente's house was full of people like this because they were the easiest to make disappear without an alarm. The structure of the boarding house made disappearance plausible. Turnover in such places is routine. A tenant might leave abruptly because a hospital bed opens up, because a relative changes their mind and offers a room, because they relapse or spiral, because they are moved by an agency, because they simply run. Disappearance, in that context, does not immediately trigger suspicion. It blends into normal instability. Puente understood that, and she used it. If a family member asked questions, the answer could be delivered calmly. The tenant moved out. The tenant went to stay with family. The tenant was transferred. The tenant didn't like the rules. The tenant left without notice. These explanations are ordinary enough that they often satisfy people, especially if those people already carry assumptions about the tenant's instability. In these cases, the victim's vulnerability becomes part of the camouflage. There is also the uncomfortable reality that the disappearance of marginalized adults does not always prompt immediate urgency. The system is trained to see non-compliance before it sees danger. Missed appointments can be read as irresponsibility rather than distress. Silence can be interpreted as choice rather than coercion. This is not malice. It is the cold consequence of overload. The people paid to care are often too stretched to look closely. The people paid to investigate often require a clear trigger to act. The people paid to deliver benefits are not paid to question who is cashing them, until patterns become impossible to ignore. That delay was part of what made the house effective. The financial theft itself took many forms, but it revolved around the same principles: identity, access, and control. A tenant's name could be used on forms. A tenant's signature could be forged. A tenant's benefits could be redirected. A tenant's personal information could be used to create or alter documents. Small administrative acts could shift thousands of dollars over time, especially if the tenant remained officially alive in the eyes of the system. The cruelty is in how ordinary these acts look. There is no dramatic confrontation in the paperwork. There is no scream. There is no blood. There is a signature that does not belong to the person it represents. There is a check cashed by someone else. There is a letter that never reaches its intended hands. There is a quiet series of transactions that tells the outside world everything is normal. And while the outside world is reassured, the inside of the house is being emptied. The system also offered Puente a second layer of protection. It supplied her with the image of legitimacy. A landlady accepting tenants on benefits can present herself as doing something good. She is giving vulnerable people somewhere to live. She is cooperating with the state. She is making room for people others might not take. This framing is powerful because it discourages suspicion. It makes questions feel ungrateful. It gives the landlady moral cover. Moral cover is one of the strongest forms of cover there is. In time, however, paperwork begins to reveal what a house is doing. Checks arrive for people who no longer answer their phones. Benefits are redirected in unusual ways. Signatures repeat with the same shape. Names vanish from contact lists. Tenants are said to have left, but their accounts are still active. The system, slow as it is, begins to show strain in the places where a lie has to be maintained. This is where the story starts to tighten. The boarding house was not only a place where victims were killed. It was a place where victims were replaced. A room emptied could be filled again. A new tenant could be recruited. A new income stream could be established. The house could keep running as a machine, and the only thing the outside world would see is an older woman helping people who needed help. The system paid, because the system did not know what it was funding. Or rather, it did not know until the pattern grew too large to ignore. Chapter 5, Rooms Filled, Rooms Emptied. A boarding house teaches people not to ask too many questions. Tenants arrive with cardboard boxes and supermarket bags. They leave with nothing more than a plastic sack. Sometimes they do not leave at all, at least, not in a way the neighbors can see. The movement becomes part of the scenery. Cars pull up. Doors open. A man is helped up the steps. A suitcase appears on the porch. A woman stands at the gate and chats as though the house is simply doing what houses do. This is how Dorothea Puente's operation survived for as long as it did. The public face of the house was busyness. A steady flow of boarders. A steady hum of domestic life. A landlady who seemed involved and present. A place where people came and went, as they always do in boarding houses. But the pattern beneath that busyness was something else. People who moved into Puente's care often stopped being seen. Names that should have remained attached to bodies became detached. Mail continued. Checks continued. The house continued. The person did not. The house could replace a tenant quickly because the world provided an endless supply of people in need. This is one of the bleak truths of the case. Puente did not have to search hard for victims. Vulnerable adults are not rare. They are everywhere. They exist in shelters, hospitals, halfway houses, on street corners, in agency waiting rooms. They exist in the spaces where society stores people it cannot comfortably absorb. A landlady offering a room can look like a lifeline. Puente's tenants were often people who needed somewhere to go immediately. They were unwell. They were elderly. They were isolated. They were living on benefits. Many had thin or broken connections to family. Some were estranged. Some were simply difficult to reach. A person without close advocates is a person the world can lose without immediate disruption. In a case like this, the house does not only serve as a place where people live. It serves as a place where people become untraceable. This is where the rhythm of the boarding house becomes important. It creates a kind of normalized instability. Tenants come and go for reasons that are often mundane: hospital stays, arguments, drinking binges, discharges from care, transfers, sudden moves. In such an environment, "he left" is always plausible. The story does not have to be convincing. It only has to be believable enough that no one feels obliged to verify it. Verification requires effort. Effort is rarely offered to those who are already seen as fragile, chaotic, or expendable. Puente understood this, and she leaned into it. She offered explanations with the confidence of someone who belonged. She spoke as though she was managing a difficult house full of difficult people. She framed her tenants in ways that supported their disappearance. They were unstable, unreliable, ungrateful, hard to handle. If they left suddenly, it made sense. If they stopped calling family, it made sense. If they did not return, it made sense. The victim's vulnerability became the landlady's script. There were also practical tools that made the house harder to penetrate from the outside. A landlady controls the entry. A landlady can tell visitors the tenant is out. A landlady can say the tenant moved away. A landlady can claim not to have forwarding information. A landlady can refuse to let outsiders wander the property. In a private house, that refusal can seem normal rather than suspicious. Most people do not push too hard at a stranger's door, especially when the stranger appears to be a kindly older woman. The gradual disappearance of tenants was not the only pattern. There was also a pattern of paperwork and small domestic disruptions that, in hindsight, signal something darker. A room suddenly cleaned aggressively. A foul smell explained away. A tenant's belongings thrown out quickly. A story told too smoothly. A new tenant moving in not long after another was said to have left. When viewed in isolation, each detail could be dismissed. When viewed as a sequence, the details begin to form a pressure point. The house also developed a reputation that could be read in two opposite ways. To some, Puente seemed charitable, taking in people others would not. To others, she seemed strict and controlling. She could be difficult. She could be volatile. She could shift quickly between warmth and anger. This volatility is not unusual in true crime, but it is also not unusual in ordinary life. Many people are unstable without being murderous. That ambiguity is part of what allowed the pattern to persist. Even those who disliked her did not necessarily imagine the worst. Imagination is restrained by what society expects. And society does not expect the elderly, the unwell, and the disabled to be systematically eliminated in a suburban house. It expects them to fade quietly, in the way marginalized people are always fading, through homelessness, institutions, overdose, illness, accidents. When such endings are common enough, murder can hide inside them. That is what makes the boarding house so haunting. It does not need to invent danger. It absorbs danger into ordinary expectation. Over time, the house became full of stories. Some were small. The landlady was odd, the tenants were rough, the property was cluttered, the atmosphere unpleasant. Some were more pointed. A tenant had vanished, a family member was asking questions, a check had been cashed strangely, a person was said to have left but their benefits were still arriving. Stories do not always lead to action. In fact, they often lead to the opposite, a kind of community fatigue. People hear rumors and shrug. People tell themselves it is not their business. People do not want conflict. People do not want to accuse. People assume that someone else, an agency, a caseworker, a relative, will handle it. This assumption is another kind of cover. The house on F Street relied on the same human instinct that so many predators rely on, the instinct to avoid making a scene. As long as there was no obvious violence spilling into the street, the neighborhood could keep the story at a safe distance. The house could remain that place with those people. The landlady could remain strange but tolerable. The disappearances could remain plausible because the victims were already half invisible to the world. Still, the pattern did not go entirely unnoticed. A handful of people began to push against the smoothness of Puente's explanations. Family members wanted to know where their loved ones had gone. Agencies began to question why people who were meant to be collecting their benefits had stopped appearing. There were tenants who noticed things. There were murmurs, then complaints, then questions that did not dissolve. This is the moment when the house's ordinary rhythm begins to falter. Because the most dangerous thing for a predator is not the police. It is someone who refuses to accept the story. Chapter 6: The First Refusals. Most predators do not get caught because they make a single dramatic mistake. They get caught because the world becomes unwilling to accept the ordinary explanations anymore. Dorothea Puente relied on a set of stories that worked precisely because they sounded familiar. Tenants moved on. Tenants went into hospital. Tenants relapsed. Tenants left without notice. In a boarding house full of vulnerable adults, these explanations were not only plausible, they were expected. But plausibility has a weakness. It depends on compliance. The first refusals in this case did not come from one heroic investigator or one sudden revelation. They came slowly, from people whose concern overcame the social pressure to accept what a landlady said. A family member who tried too many times to call. A relative who kept asking. A caseworker who found the paperwork too strange. A tenant who noticed something that did not fit. A neighbor who could not forget a smell, or the movement of cement, or the way a room was cleaned too quickly. In true crime, these are the people who matter most, not because they are flawless, but because they insist on reality when reality is inconvenient. The refusals were often small at first. A missing person report is not always treated with urgency, particularly when the missing person is an adult with disabilities, mental illness, or a history of unstable housing. Systems are trained to believe that such individuals might simply be off the radar. They might have chosen to disappear. They might be avoiding contact. They might be on a binge, in hospital, in jail, sleeping rough. These assumptions are not always wrong, but they create a dangerous default. Disappearance is treated as behaviour rather than threat. Puente depended on that default. When tenants vanished from her house, she could supply the same explanations the world already expected. A person like that does not keep in touch. A person like that is unreliable. A person like that left and didn't say goodbye. A person like that was difficult and caused problems. The landlady's words were amplified by the victim's marginalization. The refusals began when people with stronger ties pushed back against those assumptions. In some cases, relatives noticed changes that did not match the story. A person stopped calling when they always called. A person missed a birthday. A person did not show up at an expected appointment. A person who was ordinarily predictable vanished without leaving even the kind of chaos they were known for. A missing person becomes real when routine breaks. It is not always a dramatic event. It can be as small as a voice that isn't heard when it should be. It can be the absence of a habit. The house on F Street created a second obstacle for those trying to follow up: access. Even when families wanted to investigate, the landlady controlled the door. She could refuse entry. She could insist the person had already gone. She could claim she had no forwarding details. She could behave as though the inquiry was unreasonable, intrusive, even insulting. Most people are trained to respect the boundaries of a private home. That training can become fatal. Some of the refusals were bureaucratic rather than emotional. Benefits kept being cashed. Names remained active in systems, yet the individuals were not where they were meant to be. This created a particular kind of suspicion, not the suspicion of murder at first, but the suspicion of fraud. Fraud is often how investigations begin, because fraud leaves patterns that paper can detect. A person receiving disability benefits is meant to exist in the system. They are meant to appear, at least occasionally, in the places the system touches them: appointments, medical assessments, social services. When someone stops appearing but their payments continue to be collected, the system becomes uneasy. Not because it is compassionate, but because money demands accountability. Puente's house functioned at the intersection of these forces, human concern and bureaucratic suspicion. For a long time, her mask held. She could talk her way through questions. She could perform frustration at tenants who were ungrateful. She could portray herself as a long-suffering caretaker. She could offer explanations that sounded reasonable to outsiders who did not want to imagine something worse. But the longer the pattern continues, the more effort it takes to maintain. Each disappearance requires a story. Each story needs consistency. Each new tenant brings new paperwork, new checks, new opportunities, and new risk. In time, small details begin to contradict each other. A landlady claims a tenant moved away, but the tenant's belongings are still there. A landlady claims a tenant went to hospital, but there is no record. A landlady claims a tenant is living with family, but the family insists they are not. A landlady becomes evasive. A landlady offers too many explanations, too quickly. A lie is not always detected because it is unbelievable. It is detected because it becomes exhausting. The house also began to attract the attention of people who noticed unusual activity. The kind of activity that seems unremarkable until it is placed beside missing borders. Soil turned in the yard. A new garden bed. Cement. A metal shed moved or installed. The smell of decomposition explained away as plumbing or rubbish. The rapid cleaning of a room. These details are often presented in later retellings as obvious signs that should have triggered immediate intervention. That judgment is easy to make after the fact. In real time, people hesitate. They do not want to accuse. They do not want to be wrong. They do not want conflict with a neighbor. Puente benefited from that hesitation. Still, some people did not let the discomfort silence them. Their refusals became complaints. Their complaints became calls. Their calls became official attention. The case shifted slowly, from rumor to file. Once a case becomes a file, it can be passed between desks. This passing is not always swift. It is not always competent. But it changes something. It creates a paper trail that can be returned to later, and patterns can be recognized across time. Puente's story began to tighten when patterns were finally compared. One missing tenant is a tragedy. Several missing tenants connected to the same house is a question. A question can still be ignored, but it is harder to dismiss once it exists in writing, once multiple people have asked it, once it begins to look like a problem that could embarrass an agency if it is mishandled. That is one of the cold motivations that drives late intervention. Not compassion, but risk. The first refusals did not immediately bring police with shovels into the yard. They did not immediately tear away the mask. But they did something essential. They disrupted the smoothness of the landlady's stories. Once the stories stop working, a predator's world narrows quickly. Chapter 7, when the pattern showed. A disappearance can be explained. 2 disappearances can be dismissed. But eventually the story begins to repeat itself so precisely that even people trained to accept instability start to feel something shift. The repetition becomes its own evidence. Not proof of murder, not yet, but proof that the ordinary explanations are no longer sufficient. This is what began to happen around Dorothea Puente's house. The boarding house on F Street was not unusual in the way many people imagine crime scenes. It did not look like a place where violence was unfolding. It looked worn, busy, and a little chaotic, the way boarding houses often do. The tenants were vulnerable men and women, living on benefits, drifting through care systems, carrying illnesses and addictions and disabilities that made their lives messy to outsiders. The messiness itself became part of the disguise. If a tenant disappeared, the disappearance could be framed as more mess. Another disruption. Another loss in a life already full of losses. The system, already overloaded, did not always respond to these disappearances as emergencies. It responded as though they were typical instability. Puente understood this, and for years it served her. But systems have limits, and repetition tests them. The pattern began to show in the places Puente could not fully control: relatives who kept asking questions, agencies tracking benefit payments, and the inevitable conflict between what Puente claimed and what others could verify. A relative might accept an explanation once. A tenant moved out suddenly. A tenant went to stay with family. A tenant was transferred. These stories make sense the first time because they fit the profile of many vulnerable adults. The second time, they begin to sound familiar. The third time, they begin to sound rehearsed. Families began to notice that the same explanation was being used for different people. Caseworkers began to notice that multiple clients connected to the same address had stopped appearing. Agencies began to see that money was still being collected in the names of people who were not seen, not heard from, not located. These were not yet accusations of murder. They were the slow build of bureaucratic unease. Fraud is often the first alarm in cases like this, because fraud creates a trail where the victim cannot. A victim might not have a strong voice. A victim might not have a stable family. A victim might not have friends. But a victim has a check. A victim has an account. A victim exists in a system that, however imperfectly, keeps track of where money goes. The paper does not care about empathy. It cares about consistency. When benefit checks keep being cashed while the person disappears, the system begins to ask who is receiving the money. When this happens repeatedly at the same address, suspicion becomes more specific. The address becomes part of the case. This is where Puente's house begins to shift from a place where people come and go to a place where people go missing. At the same time, there were domestic details that began to feel wrong to those closest to the house. A tenant's belongings suddenly thrown away. A room cleaned so aggressively that the smell of bleach became a feature. A carpet cleaned with urgency. A vague but persistent stench explained away as plumbing. Soil turned in the yard. Concrete laid where it did not seem necessary. A metal shed installed and moved, as though the yard itself was being rearranged. To a casual observer, these things could still be explained. Houses are repaired. Yards are improved. A landlady might pour concrete for practical reasons. A shed might be shifted. A smell might come from pipes. People in crowded, low-income properties often live with odors and repairs that are constant and unpleasant. But patterns change what people see. Once someone is thinking about disappearances, concrete begins to look different. Once someone is thinking about missing tenants, the yard begins to feel different. Once someone is thinking about a person who has not been heard from in weeks, the smell stops being merely unpleasant. This is the psychological moment when a neighborhood begins to wake up. It is not sudden. It is a slow tilt towards dread. Puente's mask depended on plausibility, and plausibility depends on boredom. If neighbors and agencies remain bored by their own suspicions, if they believe nothing can really be happening, then the landlady's explanations glide through without resistance. But when the pattern shows, boredom collapses. Boredom becomes curiosity. Curiosity becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes pressure. The pressure began to land on Puente in a way she could not charm away indefinitely. More people were asking questions. More people were writing things down. More agencies were leaving notes. More files were being opened and closed and reopened. And then there were the tenants themselves. A boarding house is not only a place where people are controlled. It is also a place where people witness. Tenants notice each other. They notice absences. They notice the way a landlady reacts when asked about someone who used to eat at the table. They notice when a room is suddenly unavailable. They notice when a story changes. Even vulnerable people notice danger. They may not have the power to prove it, but they can feel it. This is an important truth of the Puente case. The victims were not invisible to each other. Inside the house, people knew who lived where. They knew routines. They knew which voices belonged in the hallway. When those voices vanished, the house did not simply become quiet. It became haunted by absence. Puente's control depended on keeping those inside the house uncertain, divided, and cautious. A tenant who begins to ask questions becomes a threat. A tenant who begins to speak to outsiders becomes a threat. A tenant who refuses to accept the landlady's explanation becomes a threat. This is where many predators escalate. Not necessarily by changing their method, but by tightening control. In cases built on exploitation, the moment suspicion rises is the moment risk rises. A predator's calm begins to falter. Decisions become sharper. Mistakes become more likely. The need to manage narratives becomes constant. Puente's pattern was beginning to show. The house was no longer simply a busy boarding house. It was becoming, in the eyes of those paying attention, a place where people arrived and did not leave. Chapter 8: The File That Would Not Close. A case becomes real when it refuses to disappear. Not when the first complaint is made, not when the first suspicion is voiced, but when the same address returns again and again in paperwork, when the same name appears across different desks, when the same question keeps being asked by different people who have never met each other. Where are they? For years, the house on F Street absorbed people the way systems often absorb them, quietly, without ceremony, without record that anyone outside the house was watching closely. But once the pattern began to show, the case shifted. It stopped being a handful of concerned relatives and uneasy tenants. It began to harden into something bureaucracies cannot easily dismiss, repeated anomalies attached to one person, one property, one story. The file would not close. This is not a romantic kind of pursuit. Bureaucracies do not chase justice the way novels suggest. They chase problems that create liability. They chase inconsistencies that could expose them to criticism. They chase patterns that suggest fraud, because fraud is a failure of control, and control is what bureaucracies exist to maintain. In Dorothea Puente's case, the first sustained attention did not come from a dramatic suspicion of murder. It came from what she had always been doing alongside the disappearances: taking money. Benefit checks continued to be cashed in the names of tenants who could not be located. Signatures were questioned. Payments were redirected. In some instances, identification appeared to have been manipulated. The system began to see what the neighborhood could not, that the flow of money did not match the supposed movement of people. A tenant might vanish from the human world, but their benefits continued to arrive. That is a kind of haunting too. When officials track fraud, they track patterns. They track who benefits. They track where checks go. They track addresses that appear again and again. If enough irregularities cluster around one property, the property becomes a focus. Not a focus of moral outrage, but of administrative attention. Administrative attention is slow, but it is persistent once it starts. The F Street house became an address that appeared too often. Too many beneficiaries connected to the same place were suddenly unreachable. Too many explanations were offered by the same woman. Too many stories ended the same way: he left, she moved, they went away, they disappeared. The suspicious part was not only the disappearances. It was how easily the landlady always had a story ready. The file grew heavier with each new concern. Every time an agency noted a missing person, every time a relative called, every time a caseworker left a memo, every time a payment continued despite a vanishing tenant, the case accumulated. Even if no one person held the full picture, the system was creating it in fragments. This is how large cases form, not through one moment of clarity, but through the slow aggregation of discomfort. Dorothea Puente, meanwhile, continued to operate as though discomfort could always be managed. Her mask had worked for so long that she treated it as a permanent shield. She could be cooperative when it served her. She could be indignant when she needed to deflect. She could present herself as a woman unfairly burdened by difficult tenants and ungrateful outsiders. She could lean on her age, her gender, her appearance, her manner. The landlady persona still worked on many people. But it began to fail on paper. Paper remembers. Paper allows a person who has never met Dorothea Puente to notice that her name appears too often. Paper allows a person in one office to realize that a person in another office has raised the same concern. Paper allows patterns to be recognized without the emotional influence of charm. This is one reason Puente's case eventually turned. The mask was built for face-to-face interaction. It could not charm a ledger. As the file thickened, the questions began to shift. At first, it was simply a matter of whereabouts. Then it became a matter of money. Then it became a matter of identity. And slowly, almost reluctantly, it edged towards the question nobody wanted to ask. If these people did not simply move away, where did they go? To ask that question is to invite a frightening answer, and most systems resist frightening answers for as long as they can. A frightening answer requires resources, investigation, time, risk. A frightening answer also implies failure. If people have been harmed and the system did not notice, then the system will be judged. Still, the file refused to close. There is a particular momentum that develops when multiple vulnerable adults vanish in connection with a single address. The story becomes harder to dismiss. The landlady becomes harder to ignore. The house becomes harder to see as merely a house. It begins to feel like a site. Not a home. A site. This is when the case moves closer to law enforcement, not because the system suddenly becomes compassionate, but because the system begins to fear its own negligence. Once enough irregularities collect around one property, ignoring it becomes riskier than looking. Puente's advantage had always been social invisibility. She operated among people whose absence was expected. But once the disappearances became a pattern, that invisibility began to shift into notoriety. Not the kind that makes headlines yet, the quieter kind, the kind that exists in office conversations and internal memos, in the wary tone a caseworker uses when mentioning an address. This is how suspicion becomes institutional. Some tenants were reported missing. Some relatives refused to accept explanations. Some agencies began to ask sharper questions about finances. The details differed, but the direction was the same. The story was no longer functioning. The house was no longer simply a place where people came and went. It was a place that kept taking people. The pressure that builds in such moments often creates a decisive event. A new complaint lands at the right desk. A family member finds the right official. A caseworker refuses to file another disappearance as routine. A search warrant is finally justified through the language the system understands: fraud, financial exploitation, evidence of wrongdoing. The system does not always intervene because it recognizes danger. It intervenes because it recognizes proof. In Puente's case, that proof began to assemble itself through financial irregularities and repeated missing tenants, and the address at the center of it all. The house on F Street. The landlady. The yard. Chapter 9. The yard. A backyard is supposed to be ordinary. It is meant for clotheslines, for weeds, for a small patch of shade where a person might sit with a cup of tea. It is meant for the slow maintenance of domestic life, trimming, sweeping, planting, throwing out rubbish. In neighborhoods full of aging houses, yards change all the time. Concrete is poured. Sheds are built. Soil is turned. People improve what they can afford to improve, when they can afford it. That ordinariness is what makes a yard such an effective hiding place. No one expects a grave where they expect laundry. The movement towards the yard did not begin with police assuming the worst. It began with pressure, the pressure of a case that had grown too heavy to be handled as a series of isolated incidents. Missing tenants and suspicious financial activity had pulled attention towards Dorothea Puente's boarding house, and once that attention settled on the property, it brought with it a new kind of question. Not where are the tenants now? Where are they physically? A person can be missing without being dead. The law knows this. Police know this. Agencies know this. But when enough people vanish around one address, the possibility of death becomes impossible to avoid. The question becomes not only investigative, but visceral. If people have died, where are the bodies? This is the point in a case where the atmosphere changes. The house is no longer merely suspicious. It becomes a potential crime scene, and the domestic details that once felt harmless begin to look like evidence. Soil. Concrete. A shed. A smell. A yard that has been altered. A landlady with too many explanations. Once the state begins to take a property seriously, the landlady's mask begins to fail quickly. The charm that works on neighbors and tenants does not work on an investigation that has reached the physical level. This is where Puente's years of control began to narrow. She could still tell stories, but stories do not stop shovels once a warrant exists. Searches are invasive by design. They strip away the privacy a predator relies on. When authorities moved towards the property, the house itself became a problem to manage. There were tenants still living inside. There were rooms to search. There were items to document. There was the challenge of investigating a place that was both home and business, both private property and a suspected crime site. Every step required procedure, and every procedure created opportunity for delay. Delay is often fatal to evidence. Yet the momentum had already shifted. The case had entered a stage where physical proof was being sought, not merely statements and paperwork. The yard mattered because it was the one part of the property that could quietly contain what the house could no longer explain. This is where the story becomes unbearable. Not because of gore, but because of the cold logic involved. A person who buries bodies in a backyard is not improvising in panic. They are using the domestic landscape as concealment. They are turning the most ordinary space into a storage place for the dead. The first digging did not occur in a cinematic rush. It occurred within the careful pace of a real search, measured, procedural, filled with the tension of not knowing whether suspicion would become discovery. It is one thing to suspect. It is another to put a shovel into the earth and be confronted with what the soil has been holding. In the public imagination, the search of Puente's yard is often reduced to a single moment, as though police dug once and immediately found everything. In reality, such searches unfold in stages. They begin with targeted areas, with signs of disturbed ground, with knowledge of where concrete has been poured, where a shed was placed, where soil looks different. They proceed slowly because they must. Evidence must be preserved. The chain of custody must be maintained. Documentation must be precise. But the emotional reality is still violent. Because every shovel of dirt is a question. And every question, in a case like this, points towards the same answer. The yard also carried another kind of clue, the way it had been managed. Concrete patches, the placement of a shed, and the arrangement of the property suggested purposeful changes rather than casual maintenance. To a casual observer, a landlady improving her yard is normal. To investigators looking for bodies, improvements become concealment techniques. Concrete does not have to be sinister. In this context, it was. A boarding house yard becomes a map. Not a garden map, but an investigative one, where the ground looks newer, where soil has been disturbed, where a structure sits that seems designed to limit access to a particular section of earth. These details do not prove murder on their own. They suggest intention, and intention is what searches are built to confirm. At this point, Puente's world began to destabilize. A predator's sense of control depends on controlling narrative. Once police are physically present on the property, narrative control is undermined. The landlady can still speak, but she can no longer decide what is seen. This is why many offenders run. Escape is not always about innocence or guilt. It is about loss of control. Once a predator realizes their environment is being penetrated by authority, flight becomes a final attempt to reclaim autonomy. The house no longer belongs to them. The yard no longer belongs to them. Their space becomes the state's space. Puente's behavior in this phase would later be interpreted through the lens of her guilt, her manipulation, her persona. But regardless of interpretation, the shift is clear: her long-running method had reached its breaking point. The pressure of files, fraud investigation, and missing tenants had finally turned into physical intrusion. The ground was being opened. And what was hidden was about to become visible. Chapter 10: What the Earth Gave Back. The first discovery changes everything. Up until that moment, suspicion can still be treated as theory. Paperwork can be argued over. Stories can be challenged, but not conclusively disproved. A landlady can still insist that tenants left, that families are confused, that agencies are mistaken, that everything looks strange only because the people involved are strange. Then the earth gives back what was placed inside it. And the case becomes irreversible. When investigators began digging in Dorothea Puente's yard, they were not excavating legend. They were excavating possibility, the possibility that the disappearances were not the kind of disappearances the system had been trained to tolerate. They were looking for proof that would force the state to acknowledge what a woman's charm and a boarding house's normal turnover had concealed. The search did not unfold as a single dramatic reveal. It moved through procedure, through tension, through the quiet discipline of people trained not to react too quickly. That discipline is necessary. Evidence must be preserved. Scenes must be documented. There are protocols for what to do when soil begins to say what a suspect will not. Even so, the emotional reality of a search like this is unavoidable. Because digging is not neutral once the aim is to find bodies. Every patch of disturbed ground becomes a question. Every shovel becomes an accusation. Every careful movement of dirt becomes a moment of waiting, because whatever is found cannot be unseen. The yard behind the F Street house had been altered in ways that looked, from a distance, like ordinary property maintenance. Concrete had been poured. A shed had been placed. The earth had been turned. In a city filled with aging houses and odd repairs, this could still be explained, until the search turned those changes into a map. Once investigators found the first set of remains, the house stopped being merely suspicious. It became a crime scene. This shift is not only legal. It is psychological. The neighborhood changes. The tone changes. The way officials speak changes. The questions become sharper, and the actions become faster, because what has been found suggests not a single incident but an intentional pattern. Discovery makes people look backwards differently. It makes older complaints feel heavier. It makes missing persons reports feel like missed warnings. It makes the landlady's explanations collapse into something that now sounds rehearsed rather than plausible. As the yard continued to be searched, more remains were located. They were buried in multiple areas. The implication was immediate. This was not an isolated death hidden in panic. This was repeated disposal. Repeated concealment. Repeated success. The boarding house had not simply been a place where people disappeared. It had been a place where people were placed. The bodies were not found in a way that produced neat answers in an instant. Identification can take time, particularly when remains have been buried and weathered by soil. The process often depends on medical records, dental comparison, and forensic work that unfolds over weeks and months rather than hours. The public imagination tends to treat discovery as the end of mystery. In reality, discovery is often only the beginning of the long work of naming. Naming is one of the most important steps a case like this can take, because the victims were already vulnerable to being reduced to numbers. The victims found in Puente's yard were largely men and women who had moved through life without the kind of status that forces the world to remember them. They were not famous. They were not protected. Many lived on benefits, lived with illness, lived with instability, lived quietly. Now their existence could no longer be denied. The scale of what was uncovered produced a particular kind of shock. The shock of realizing that a suburban property could hold so much death without any dramatic signs spilling into the street. It confirmed a truth that people resist, because it is too uncomfortable. A person can be murdered in the middle of a neighborhood, repeatedly, and the crime can remain invisible if the victims are the kind of people society is used to losing. The case also forced a hard question about Dorothea Puente's role. The yard did not dig itself. Someone placed the bodies there. Someone concealed them. Someone managed the house in the meantime, continued recruiting tenants, continued collecting checks, continued speaking calmly to neighbors, continued answering questions with rehearsed stories. The discovery made it impossible to treat Puente as merely eccentric or unlucky or misunderstood. It pushed her into the center of the narrative in a way she could no longer control. As the search expanded, the property became crowded with officials, forensic staff, and the beginnings of media attention. A boarding house that had existed in the margin of society suddenly became a stage. Police tape, cameras, neighbors watching from footpaths, reporters asking questions. The house, once protected by its ordinariness, became extraordinary. And that shift created a new risk, that the victims would be swallowed again, this time not by bureaucracy, but by spectacle. Cases like this are often remembered for the villain and the shock. They should be remembered for what the shock reveals, how vulnerable lives can be treated as disposable until a body forces acknowledgement. When the bodies were found, Puente could no longer rely on the slow pace of bureaucratic attention to protect her. The case had moved into a different realm, criminal investigation driven by physical evidence, driven by death, driven by proof the public could understand without needing to study paperwork. This is usually the moment when an offender's behavior changes. For years, Puente had operated within controlled space. Her house. Her yard. Her tenants. Her mailbox. Her stories. Now her house was no longer hers alone. The yard was being opened. The state had entered the one area she could not talk her way out of. This is the moment when many long-running offenders attempt to flee. Not because fleeing proves guilt on its own, but because the loss of control becomes intolerable. Once a predator is confronted with physical evidence, the narrative they have been telling can no longer hold. They can no longer manage perception. They can no longer explain the problem away. The problem is in the ground. The discovery phase did not conclude the case. It ignited it. Because once the yard began to reveal the dead, the next step was inevitable. Dorothea Puente herself would need to be taken into custody. Chapter 11. Flight. A predator can endure suspicion. Suspicion is still negotiable. Suspicion can be talked down, delayed, redirected. Suspicion lives in conversation and paperwork, and Dorothea Puente had spent most of her life learning how to handle both. She knew how to perform normality. She knew how to sound offended. She knew how to appear cooperative. She knew how to make others feel unreasonable for questioning her. But bodies are not negotiable. Once remains were found in the yard, the case was no longer built on interpretation. It was built on death. The landlady's stories had been functioning like a soft wall, holding back scrutiny through plausible explanations. That wall collapsed the moment the ground gave back what it had been made to hide. What followed was not immediate closure. It was movement. In the hours and days that followed the first discoveries, the boarding house turned into a scene that could no longer be managed quietly. The property drew police, forensic staff, and inevitably the press. Neighbors gathered, watching from footpaths. The house, once shielded by its ordinariness, became the center of a public nightmare. In this environment, Puente's mask could not hold. Not because she suddenly looked guilty, she had been adept at appearing harmless, but because the circumstances had changed so completely that there was no longer a version of the story in which she could remain simply a peculiar landlady. Her house had become associated with multiple bodies. Her yard had become evidence. The attention was no longer optional. At this point, investigators had a problem, and Puente knew it. A person who has lived through decades of fraud and manipulation understands how systems work. They understand the point at which a system shifts from slow to swift. They understand the moment when a file becomes urgent, when questions become warrants, when checking becomes searching, when concerns become charges. They also understand that once physical evidence exists, the system becomes harder to stall. Flight often begins as a small decision. Not necessarily a dramatic sprint, but a shift into motion, leaving before anyone can legally prevent it, leaving before there is a formal arrest, leaving before the last thread of control is pulled out of the hands of the offender. In this case, Puente's flight is often described through an infamous detail. She left the property under the guise of running an errand, claiming she was going to buy coffee and donuts for the officers involved. Whether the specific phrasing was exactly that or later stylized, the shape of the act is what matters. It was a familiar tactic, appearing helpful, appearing harmless, and using that harmlessness to create the opportunity to walk away. It was, in its own way, the final performance. A woman who has built her life on deception does not always flee in panic. She flees in character. The flight itself becomes a manipulation, leaving in a way that looks like nothing at all, leaving with the calm confidence of someone who belongs. But once she was gone, she did not return. That is when the boarding house became not only a crime scene but a pivot point in a manhunt. Law enforcement now had two urgent tasks: continue the search and identify the dead, and locate the landlady who had disappeared at the moment the case became undeniable. Flight is not proof of murder in isolation. But in context, it becomes part of the pattern. A woman who had offered explanations, who had positioned herself as caretaker, who had presented herself as cooperative, now removed herself from the only place where questions could be answered. It is difficult to reconcile such a departure with innocence. Flight also reveals something about Puente's psychology. Control mattered to her more than the performance of cooperation. As long as she could maintain the role of harmless landlady, she could keep the house functioning. She could keep tenants arriving. She could keep checks coming. She could keep suspicion at the level of murmurs. But the yard had made the story physical. And physical evidence cannot be smoothed away with charm. For the public, the image of a landlady slipping away while bodies were being pulled from her property is the moment the story becomes cinematic. It has all the elements of a thriller: the quiet house, the shocking discovery, the suspect who disappears. It is a moment that the media would later seize upon, because it gives narrative clarity: the villain flees. Yet even this dramatic pivot contains something more unsettling than drama. It shows how long Puente had been able to operate without the system moving quickly enough to restrain her. Even after bodies were found, there was still a window in which she could leave. That window was built out of procedure. A search is not always paired with immediate arrest. Legal steps must be taken. Charges must be assembled. Evidence must be documented. Investigators may be looking for a larger picture before acting. In real cases, these procedural necessities can create spaces where offenders slip away. Puente's decades of experience with systems likely taught her to recognize that space instinctively. Once she fled, the story entered its next phase: tracking, locating, closing the net. Her age and appearance worked in her favor. She did not look like the public's image of a killer. She could move through ordinary places without inspiring immediate fear. She could present herself as confused, frail, harmless, all the same masks that had served her for years. But this time, the case had changed. There were bodies behind her house, and the nation had begun to pay attention. Chapter 12: Capture. Flight does not erase a crime scene. It only changes the shape of the case. Once Dorothea Puente disappeared from her boarding house, the investigation split into two urgent streams. The yard continued to be searched and the dead continued to be uncovered, while the living focus shifted to one question: where is she now? A manhunt does not always look like sirens and roadblocks. More often it looks like phone calls, bulletins, and names passed between departments. It looks like investigators reconstructing likely routes, likely contacts, likely places where a person might go when they want to vanish without abandoning the comfort of civilization. It looks like the state doing what it does best, building a net out of information. Puente's advantage had always been that she looked ordinary. Even after the discovery of bodies, she remained physically an older woman, the kind of person who could sit on a bench, buy a meal, or check into a motel without anyone feeling immediate alarm. That ordinariness is not merely a disguise. It is a social shield. People tend to register danger by appearance, and Puente did not fit the most common profile of what the public imagines danger to be. She could move through the world under the protection of expectation. But her name was now attached to a house full of the dead. Once a suspect's name becomes public and a case becomes widely known, ordinariness begins to work against them. A face that once blended in begins to stand out. People look more closely. Clerks, motel staff, patrons in cafes and bars, ordinary members of the public become part of the investigative environment. A wanted person has fewer safe places to exist. Puente's flight did not take her far in terms of geography, but it took her far in terms of narrative. She was no longer the landlady managing a boarding house. She was the central figure in a case that had begun to resemble something unthinkable, a serial offender operating under the guise of care. In the days following her disappearance, law enforcement expanded the search beyond Sacramento. The details of her movement were pieced together through the kind of fragments most fugitives leave behind without noticing: transactions, sightings, conversations. A person fleeing cannot move through the world without touching it. Even if cash is used, even if names are false, the body still occupies space. Eventually, Puente was located in Los Angeles, in a hotel. The distance between Sacramento and Los Angeles is not only physical. It is symbolic. Los Angeles is a city where people disappear easily. It is large, anonymous, crowded with transients. A person can become one more face in a place already full of faces. For Puente, it would have been a logical place to hide, close enough to remain within familiar terrain, far enough to create a gap, and vast enough to blur. But hiding in a hotel is never truly hiding. It is simply delaying. Hotels have staff. Hotels have records. Hotels have people coming and going. A fugitive may feel anonymous in such places, but that anonymity is fragile. Once a suspect is known, a single recognition can collapse it. Puente's arrest was not the culmination of a single chase scene. It was the inevitable closing of a net. When authorities moved in, she was taken into custody without the kind of drama later retellings often prefer. The drama did not need to be manufactured. It already existed in the facts that were waiting back at the house. The arrest mattered not because of how it was performed, but because it ended her last act of control. A fugitive can still tell stories. A fugitive can still insist on innocence. A fugitive can still perform harmlessness. But once in custody, the state controls the timeline. The state controls access. The state controls the environment in which questions are asked. Puente, who had spent her life managing narrative, was now being managed. Her arrest did not conclude the investigation. It intensified it. With Puente in custody, the boarding house could be treated fully as an investigative site without the complication of her presence. The yard could continue to be excavated. Forensic identification could proceed. Paperwork could be seized, examined, and compared against benefits records. Witnesses could be re-interviewed with the knowledge that the landlady could no longer intimidate them through proximity. A serial case is rarely solved by one discovery alone. It is solved by accumulation: bodies, paperwork, testimony, patterns of fraud, timelines, and the slow building of a prosecutable story. That work began in earnest once Puente was arrested. Meanwhile, Puente herself became the subject of public fascination. The contrast between appearance and accusation sharpened the media's appetite. She was described in ways that emphasized that contrast: an older woman, a grandmotherly figure, a landlady, someone who seemed harmless. The public imagination, hungry for the shock of contradiction, began turning her into a character almost immediately. A female offender is often treated as an aberration, either demonized beyond reason or turned into spectacle. The press tends to frame such women through gendered language: mother, grandmother, caretaker. The label is not neutral. It shapes how the public processes the crime. Puente's case was already being framed as the nightmare version of domestic safety. A home that killed. A landlady who collected lives the way she collected checks. The system now had to do something more difficult than arrest a suspect. It had to prove what happened in that house. Chapter 13: Building the Case. A trial does not begin in court. It begins in the quiet, exhausting work of turning horror into evidence. Once Dorothea Puente was in custody, the state faced a challenge that went beyond arrest. The public might have been satisfied with the spectacle of a captured suspect, but the law demands something else. It demands a story built from proof. It demands names, dates, causes of death, chains of custody, and timelines that can withstand attack. It demands that the dead be transformed into a case a jury can understand without collapsing into emotion. This is the grim machinery of justice, the translation of human lives into legal language. Back at the F Street property, the yard continued to be excavated and documented. The work was slow because it had to be. Every fragment mattered. Every discovery had to be photographed, mapped, and handled according to strict procedure. The smallest error could become a defense strategy later. A careless moment could allow a defense lawyer to suggest contamination, mishandling, uncertainty. In a case like this, the state does not simply need to be right. It needs to be unimpeachable. Forensic identification became central. Bodies recovered from soil do not always offer immediate clarity, particularly when decomposition has progressed and remains have been buried in ways that complicate recognition. Investigators had to match remains to missing persons reports, to benefits records, to medical histories. They had to use the tools available: dental comparisons, medical imaging records, and any physical identifiers that could survive burial. This process is often invisible to the public, yet it is one of the most crucial acts of respect a case can offer its victims. Naming is a form of restoration. The victims in Puente's case were people who had already been treated as marginal. Many had been moved through systems where individuality is often reduced to diagnosis or benefit status. To name them in death is to refuse their erasure. At the same time, investigators traced the paper trail that had become Puente's second method. It was not enough to show that people died. The state needed to show how Puente benefited, how she gained access, how she maintained control. Fraud, forged signatures, redirected checks, false identification, these were not side issues. They were part of the structure that made the murders possible and part of the motive the state could argue clearly. Money is often the most legible motive in court. It gives the jury something tangible to hold. In building the case, investigators worked backwards through Puente's boarding house history. They looked at tenancy records, if any existed. They examined who had lived there, who had stopped being seen, who had relatives or agencies asking questions. They compared dates of benefit payments against reported disappearances. They gathered statements from neighbors, former tenants, and anyone who had witnessed odd activity at the house. These witnesses mattered because they created context: the smells, the concrete, the cleaning, the shifting stories. A body in the yard is proof of death. Witnesses help establish the environment in which death was concealed. But witnesses are also vulnerable to challenge. Memories are imperfect. People exaggerate when they are frightened. People misremember dates. People repeat rumors. The defense can exploit this. That is why the state needed more than testimony. It needed evidence that did not rely on emotional recollection. That evidence came from the combination of forensics and financial documentation. Toxicology reports, where possible, began to shape the narrative. Certain victims were found to have been sedated. Certain drugs appeared repeatedly. This repetition suggested method, not an impulsive killing, but a practice of making people helpless before ending them. A repeated method creates a pattern, and pattern strengthens prosecution. It suggests intention rather than accident. It suggests planning rather than chaos. It also suggests that the offender believed they could keep doing it. The victim's vulnerability became relevant in court not as an excuse, but as an explanation of how the crime could persist. A jury needed to understand why so many people could vanish without immediate intervention. The state would have to explain the social context, that vulnerable adults often move through life without a tight web of protection, that agencies are overworked, that disappearances can be misread as instability. This context does not lessen the crime. It clarifies its opportunity. The defense, meanwhile, would inevitably aim to blur responsibility. A boarding house contains many people. A property is not always controlled by one set of hands alone. Puente's defense could suggest that tenants fought, that others had access, that someone else could have placed bodies in the yard, that Puente was simply an unfortunate landlady whose property attracted tragedy. In cases involving shared spaces, the question of exclusive control becomes crucial. Who had access to the yard? Who managed the property? Who controlled the mail? Who benefited from the payments? Who told the stories about where tenants went? The more tightly these questions pointed to Puente, the stronger the case became. The state also had to confront the unevenness of certainty. Not all deaths connected to Puente's house could be prosecuted equally. Some victims were easier to link directly to her through paperwork or witness accounts. Others were harder, their timelines less clear, their identities harder to prove, their causes of death less precise. This is one of the most painful realities of serial cases. Legal truth is often narrower than lived truth. The state must choose charges it believes it can prove beyond reasonable doubt. That choice does not necessarily reflect the full scope of harm. It reflects the scope of what will survive a courtroom. In assembling charges, prosecutors focused on cases with the strongest combination of evidence: bodies found on the property, identifiable victims, financial exploitation linked to Puente, and forensic findings that suggested sedative use. These cases offered the best chance of conviction. The public, watching the case unfold in headlines, wanted a simple conclusion: that Puente was guilty of everything and that she would be punished accordingly. The legal system rarely delivers such simplicity. Trials are not designed to satisfy the public's sense of scale. They are designed to test specific charges. This mismatch between public expectation and legal reality is often where frustration begins. By the time the case moved towards trial, Puente had already become a cultural figure. The killer landlady narrative had taken hold. The house on F Street was being spoken about as though it were a character in its own right. Reporters described the yard with a kind of morbid fascination. The public tried to reconcile the image of an older woman with the brutality implied by multiple bodies. In court, however, none of that would matter unless it could be turned into evidence. The case would rise or fall not on atmosphere, but on proof. Chapter 14: The Trial. In the public imagination, a trial is where truth is revealed. In reality, a trial is where truth is negotiated. It is not an open window into everything that happened. It is a structured contest governed by rules that limit what can be said, how it can be said, and what a jury is allowed to consider. Evidence must be admissible. Witnesses must be credible. Stories must be reduced to timelines and exhibits. Grief must be translated into language a courtroom can tolerate. For the families of Dorothea Puente's victims, the trial was not a story. It was the state's promise that the dead would not be dismissed as disappearances any longer. For the state, it was a burden. Serial cases are difficult to prosecute even when bodies exist, and they are especially difficult when victims are vulnerable adults who lived on society's margins. The public expects clarity. The courtroom demands precision. The prosecutor must prove not only that people died, but that the accused is responsible beyond reasonable doubt. Puente's trial carried a particular kind of tension because of how the crimes unfolded. They were not a spree in public space. They were not captured on film. They did not occur in a single night that could be reconstructed neatly. They occurred over years inside a house that functioned both as home and business. People moved in and out. Witnesses came and went. Memories blurred. Paperwork continued even as bodies disappeared. The state had to build a case sturdy enough to survive the defense's inevitable strategy, fracture. The prosecution's approach centered on pattern, control, and motive. Bodies were found on Puente's property. That was the foundation. But bodies alone do not always prove who killed. The state needed to establish that Puente had both opportunity and control. The prosecution emphasized that Puente was the landlady. She managed the house, controlled access, controlled the mail, controlled the tenant list, and controlled the story outsiders were told when tenants vanished. In other words, she controlled the environment where the deaths occurred. The prosecution also highlighted the financial exploitation. Puente's use of tenants' benefit checks and identities was not presented as an afterthought. It was presented as motive and method, a way to explain why tenants were taken in, why they were isolated, and why they disappeared. Money is not the only motive serial offenders have, but it is one of the easiest to argue in court because it leaves evidence. It creates paper trails. It can be demonstrated through bank records, forged documents, identification misuse, and the movement of funds. Jurors may struggle to imagine murder committed repeatedly for pleasure, but they can understand murder committed repeatedly for profit. Profit gives the crime a logic a jury can grasp. The prosecution also presented forensic findings, including evidence of sedation where it could be established. The repeated appearance of sedative or psychiatric drugs in victims' bodies pointed towards a method: make the person helpless, then kill. The medical evidence supported the idea that death was not random, not accidental, not self-inflicted. The defense's job was to break this shape. In serial cases, the defense often does not need to prove innocence. It only needs to introduce doubt. With multiple victims, the defense can attempt to weaken individual counts by attacking identification, timelines, forensic certainty, and the possibility that someone else had access. A boarding house provides opportunities for such doubt. Other tenants lived there. Visitors came and went. The yard could, in theory, be accessed. The defense can argue, the bodies were on the property, yes, but that does not prove who put them there. The defense can argue, the accused may have been involved in fraud, yes, but fraud is not murder. The defense can argue, the victims were vulnerable and unstable, yes, but that makes their deaths harder to interpret. This is one reason vulnerable victims are so often exploited. Their vulnerability becomes not only a reason they are easy to harm, but a reason their harm is harder to prove. The courtroom is not built for nuance. It is built for certainty. If forensic evidence is incomplete, if witness testimony is inconsistent, if dates are uncertain, if a victim's life was chaotic, then the defense can use that chaos as a weapon. The prosecution, therefore, had to choose its strongest cases carefully. The jury did not hear every allegation ever connected to Puente. The jury heard the cases the state believed could be proven. This distinction matters because the public often assumes that a trial contains the entire truth of a serial offender's history. It rarely does. It contains what can be supported within the legal framework. Puente's trial also carried the spectacle of contrast. The accused did not fit the public standard image of a killer. Her age, her appearance, her manner, all of it conflicted with the brutality suggested by the evidence. This contrast can influence juries in complicated ways. It can make the accused seem more monstrous because the crimes feel more unnatural coming from that body. It can also make the accused seem less capable because the image of harm does not align with the person in the chair. In such cases, the courtroom becomes a theater where identity is constantly being argued. Was Dorothea Puente a harmless old woman? Or was she a predator who understood exactly how to use that image? The state had to prove the second. The defense, implicitly or explicitly, leaned on the first. Witnesses were called. Experts testified. The yard was described. The financial records were presented. The victims' lives were reconstructed as far as possible. Each count was its own small story, yet the prosecution needed the jury to see the larger story, not isolated deaths, but a repeated method operating under a single roof. This is where the case becomes psychologically unbearable, because the larger story suggests something people do not want to accept, that a person can kill quietly repeatedly, without the world noticing, as long as the victims are the kind of people the world is used to losing. The trial was the point where that truth became public. In the end, The jury delivered a verdict that reflected both the strength of the evidence and the limitations of legal certainty. Puente was convicted of 3 murders. Other counts ended in deadlock. The verdict did not satisfy the full appetite of those who believed she had killed more. It did not answer every question. It did not provide a neat number that could close the story. But it did something crucial. It made the state say, officially, that she killed. Convictions are a form of naming, too. They mark responsibility. They acknowledge victims not as rumors, but as people whose deaths mattered enough to be prosecuted. Still, even this official acknowledgement carried an unease. Because a conviction for 3 murders did not automatically resolve the question of how many died. It did not erase the bodies in the yard. It did not erase the years of missing tenants. It did not erase the possibility that the house held more than the courtroom could prove. Chapter 15, Sentence. A verdict is not the end of a story. It is the end of a legal argument. When Dorothea Puente was convicted of 3 murders, the state had achieved what it was structurally designed to achieve. A jury agreed that she was responsible beyond reasonable doubt for the deaths they were asked to judge. The courtroom had done its work. The system had produced an outcome that could be recorded, repeated, and enforced. But for the victims, and for the families left behind, the verdict did not resolve the most persistent question. How many? In cases involving vulnerable victims, justice is often incomplete not because the offender is misunderstood, but because the evidence does not survive well enough to satisfy the law. The public can feel certain long before a jury is allowed to be certain. The yard, the pattern, the fraud, the years, all of it can suggest a scale larger than the number of convictions. Yet the legal system is not built to prosecute suspicion. It prosecutes charges that can survive cross-examination. Puente's sentencing reflected this tension. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was a blunt punishment, and it was meant to be. A life sentence acknowledges that the offender is a continuing risk, that the harm done is severe enough to warrant permanent removal from society. It is a form of containment, not redemption. It does not attempt to rehabilitate. It attempts to prevent. Containment, however, is not the same as closure. A sentence does not restore the dead. It does not rewrite the years in which the house continued operating. It does not undo the loneliness and vulnerability that made the victims easy targets. It does not answer the lingering questions left by deadlocked counts and suspected victims. What it does is create a line in the record. This is what happened, the state says. This person did it. This person will not walk free again. For Puente, life imprisonment also carried an irony that the public rarely notices at first. She spent her final years under a system of control and surveillance, deprived of freedom, deprived of the private domain that had allowed her crimes to flourish. She had created a small world in which she was the gatekeeper. In prison, she became the one controlled by gates. The state, which had moved so slowly in recognizing what was happening in her house, now moved decisively in containing her. But the public's relationship with the case did not stop at containment. If the legal story ends with sentencing, the cultural story begins there. A woman like Dorothea Puente becomes a symbol quickly. The labels that formed during the investigation hardened into a permanent identity: death house landlady, killer landlady, the older woman who buried boarders in her yard. The case offered a narrative the media could package easily because it combined 2 things that sell: horror and contradiction. A grand motherly figure. A suburban house. Multiple bodies. The contrast is irresistible to storytelling because it feels like a violation of natural order. It reassures the public that the criminal is not like us, because no ordinary person could reconcile those images in one body. It also fuels fascination, because the public wants to understand how the mask worked so well. This is where victims begin to risk being lost again. When a case becomes a cultural phenomenon, attention shifts towards the offender. The offender becomes the character. The house becomes the setting. The victims become boarders, a word that suggests transience rather than personhood. Names and lives are compressed into a list. Individuals become props in a story about evil. This is one of the greatest injustices true crime can commit. A victim is a human being, not an ingredient. Yet even in responsible coverage, victims can be difficult to keep central because the offender's story is more visible. Dorothea Puente spoke, lied, charmed, and performed. She left behind the kind of narrative material that journalists and documentary makers are trained to use. The victims left behind silence, and silence is harder to sell. Life imprisonment without parole does not fix this. If anything, it can intensify it. Once an offender is sentenced, the public no longer needs to worry about them walking free. The offender becomes safe to consume as entertainment. The horror becomes something the public can watch from a distance. The sentence therefore becomes the pivot point between justice and myth. From that point on, Dorothea Puente existed in two forms: the convicted murderer locked away, and the cultural figure reshaped by retelling. Interviews, documentaries, books, sensational headlines, each one added another layer to her public identity. Over time, the details most useful for drama grew larger, while the quieter truths became background. This is why a truth-first manuscript must pause here. Because the sentence is not only a legal endpoint. It is also the beginning of distortion. The facts remain: Puente was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to life without parole. The bodies found on her property remain. The fraud remains. The pattern remains. These are the anchors. But around those anchors, stories begin to grow. Some exaggerate the number of victims. Some invent scenes of confrontation. Some treat the case as gothic entertainment. Some frame Puente as a diabolical mastermind. Some frame her as a strange aberration. Some focus on the yard so intensely that the victims become almost abstract, reduced to a gruesome discovery rather than named lives. Chapter 16: The Making of a Monster. After sentencing, the legal story stops needing the public. The cultural story does not. Once Dorothea Puente was safely contained in prison, the case was no longer urgent in the way live investigations are urgent. There was no longer a suspect at large. There was no longer a risk of immediate harm. The fear that drives public attention shifted into something calmer and more enduring: fascination. This is the stage where true crime becomes mythology. It happens in almost every notorious case, but it happens with particular force when the offender is a woman, because the public often does not know how to contain female violence inside its usual categories. A violent man can be filed away as familiar, brute, predator, killer. A violent woman is treated as a disruption. Her crimes provoke not only anger but confusion, because they collide with expectations about caretaking, gentleness, and domesticity. Puente's case offered an irresistible contradiction. A boarding house landlady, described as grandmotherly, linked to multiple bodies buried in her yard. The press did what the press is designed to do: it sharpened the story into a single repeatable image. Headlines reduced complexity into an archetype. Dorothea Puente became the killer landlady, the death house figure, the woman who turned charity into predation. This framing did not require invention. The facts were already horrific. But framing determines what people remember. The more the story was repeated, the more the repetition shaped the meaning. The house became a symbol. The yard became the center of the narrative. The landlady became a character, not simply a convicted murderer, but a cultural monster. A monster, by definition, is simpler than a human being. A monster does not need a complicated childhood or decades of fraud. A monster does not require social context. A monster does not require the reader to think about how vulnerable adults fall through cracks. A monster is convenient because it contains the horror in one body. It suggests that the problem was a single evil person, rather than a system that failed to protect the people she targeted. This is one reason monsters are so popular. They are psychologically comforting. If the crime can be explained as the work of a monster, then ordinary people do not have to examine how easily the victims were discarded by the world before Puente ever touched them. The transformation of Puente into an archetype followed predictable patterns. Her appearance was emphasized. Photographs circulated that highlighted her age and expression, creating a kind of visual shorthand: the harmless-looking old woman who was not harmless at all. The contrast did half the work of storytelling on its own. It allowed audiences to feel shocked repeatedly, even after they knew the outcome. Her role as caretaker was exaggerated. Even though she was a landlady, the narrative often leaned on the idea that she was offering refuge, feeding people, assisting them, behaving like a community helper. This sharpened the betrayal at the center of the case. The person who looked like safety was the danger. The house became gothic without needing to be old in the European sense. It became a domestic horror site, a suburban property where death was hidden beneath ordinary life. The idea that multiple bodies could be buried in a backyard became the detail that audiences seized upon because it is both intimate and unthinkable. It turns the safety of home into a threat. That reversal is what Gothic stories have always done. The case was therefore repeatedly framed in Gothic terms, even if the word Gothic was not used. A house with secrets. A woman with a mask. A yard that held the dead. A neighborhood that did not know. The story began to function like a modern folktale about danger inside domestic calm. In these retellings, the victims often became secondary. Their names were sometimes mentioned, but rarely held for long. Their lives were compressed into categories: elderly boarders, disabled tenants, people on welfare. Even when journalists meant to be respectful, they often struggled against the gravity of the offender's narrative. Puente was the figure with face recognition, with a persona, with a house attached to her name. The victims, many of whom lived quietly, were not as easily turned into public symbols. This is not because they mattered less. It is because the world is trained to remember perpetrators better than victims. Puente's case also attracted the kind of speculation that thrives when public curiosity outlives legal certainty. The number of victims became a point of fascination. Some accounts inflated it. Some treated suspected victims as confirmed. Some repeated rumors without careful distinction. Over time, the difference between convicted of and linked to blurred in the public mind. This is how myth expands. The public often wants a single number, a clean body count, because numbers create the illusion of understanding. But the reality of serial cases is rarely neat, and it is especially messy when the victims are marginalized and the evidence is uneven across years. The result is a strange cultural phenomenon: the offender becomes both known and unknowable. Dorothea Puente was convicted, sentenced, and contained, yet the full scope of her crimes remained debated in popular retelling. This uncertainty fed fascination rather than diminishing it. The making of a monster also required simplification of motive. Puente is often remembered as killing purely for money, and money was undeniably part of the case. But reducing the motive to money alone can flatten the psychology of what was happening in the house. A person who kills repeatedly does not simply want money. They also want power. They want control. They want the ability to decide who exists and who does not. They want the satisfaction of domination hidden beneath domestic normality. Money is a motive that courts can argue. Control is a motive that culture remembers. This is where Puente's cultural identity begins to harden into something larger than her trial record. She becomes the embodiment of domestic predation, the figure who turns the idea of care into threat. She becomes a warning that the most dangerous person might not be the stranger in the alley, but the familiar figure offering help. This is why the story stuck. It spoke directly to fear. Fear of being dependent. Fear of being old. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of being placed somewhere and never leaving. Fear of trusting the wrong person. The monster narrative, however, carries a cost. It can obscure the most important truth the case has to offer. Puente was able to do what she did not because she was supernatural, but because her victims were vulnerable and the system around them was porous. A monster story suggests an anomaly. A truth-first story reveals a pattern. Chapter 17, Who Gets Forgotten. The victims in this case were never meant to be famous. They were not people whose lives attracted attention, not in the way the world tends to notice. Many were older. Many were unwell. Many lived with disability, mental illness, addiction, or the long bruises of poverty. They relied on benefits and caseworkers and systems that were designed to keep them alive, yet rarely had the resources to keep them safe. They did not vanish from a place of privilege. They vanished from the margins. This is why Dorothea Puente's story is so unsettling, and why it must be told in a way that refuses to let the victims become scenery. The horror is not only that a landlady killed. The horror is that she killed people the world had already trained itself to misplace. To understand who gets forgotten, the question is not only who Puente targeted. It is why those targets were available. A boarding house draws people who need a room quickly. They arrive with tired bodies and uncertain futures. They arrive with government checks, medication bottles, and belongings that can fit into bags. Many arrive alone. Some have families, but those families are strained, distant, exhausted, or simply powerless to intervene in a system that treats vulnerable adults as difficult cases rather than human beings. In this environment, a person can be both alive and half missing already. That half missing quality is not a moral failure of the victim. It is a structural reality. If someone has been moved through institutions, shelters, hospitals, prisons, and temporary rooms, their life becomes fragmented. Fragmentation makes it difficult for others to track them. It makes it difficult for friends to remain close. It makes it difficult for family to remain connected. It also makes it easier for agencies to lose them, because agencies often rely on contact and compliance. The system is built for those who can keep appointments. The system struggles with those who cannot. Puente's victims were often people whose lives did not run smoothly enough to satisfy bureaucracy. Some missed calls. Some missed forms. Some missed scheduled check-ins. If they disappeared, the system could interpret the absence as a continuation of that pattern. They became hard to locate. They became out of contact. They became, in the language of administration, non-compliant. When a person is labeled non-compliant, the urgency of their disappearance can soften. That softening is fatal. Puente did not need to overpower victims in the way predators in public spaces often do. She did not need to chase. She did not need to abduct. She did not need to risk attention. She only needed to place herself in the role of caretaker and control the environment. The boarding house provided that environment. It gave her proximity. It gave her access to identity documents. It gave her access to medication. It gave her the ability to observe routines and weaknesses. It gave her the ability to isolate tenants from outside contact. It gave her the power to decide who was seen and who was not. Most importantly, it gave her victims who were unlikely to be vigorously defended. This is not said to accuse the families of failing their loved ones. Many families were trying. Many families were frightened. Many families were already dealing with the complexity of supporting someone who had been ill or difficult or struggling for years. In some cases, relatives did push hard, and those refusals helped build the case. But the broader truth remains: vulnerable adults are easier to harm because fewer people are positioned to protect them. Protection is not only about love. It is about power. A wealthy person disappears and people demand answers. A poor person disappears and people assume a reason. An elderly person disappears and people assume decline. A disabled person disappears and people assume instability. A person with mental illness disappears and people assume relapse. These assumptions are not always cruel in intent, but they are cruel in effect. They create a world where disappearance becomes ordinary. Puente's victims were also vulnerable to a particular kind of manipulation, the promise of safety. For a person who has been moved through unstable housing, the offer of a stable room can feel like rescue. A house with meals, routines, and a landlady who appears attentive can feel like a return to dignity. For some, it may have been the first place in years that looked like a home. This is where the emotional betrayal becomes sharp. The thing they needed most, shelter, became the mechanism used against them. True crime often treats victims as passive, but it is important to understand that most of Puente's victims were not naive. They were not children. They were not unaware that the world could be harsh. Many had lived through hardship, addiction, violence, and institutional neglect. They were not lacking intelligence. They were lacking protection. That distinction matters, because it highlights what Puente's case reveals about society. She did not invent vulnerable people. She exploited a supply created by social failure. She took advantage of the fact that the world has always had a place for those it does not know what to do with, and that place is often a room in someone else's house. The public's fascination with Puente also reflects this. The case is remembered partly because it strikes at domestic fear. A home is meant to be safe. An older woman is meant to be safe. A caretaker is meant to be safe. When those assumptions are violated, the public reacts strongly, because it threatens the comfort of ordinary life. Yet the victims were already living without much comfort. Their lives were already shaped by the knowledge that safety is conditional. That is the bitter irony. The people most horrified by the story are often those who cannot imagine being in the position of those who were targeted. They cannot imagine being forced into dependence, forced into boarding house life, forced into trusting a stranger with the key to their survival. The victims did not have the luxury of imagining. They lived it. After the trial and sentencing, many of the victims' names became attached to the case only as evidence. Their lives were reduced to the moments they entered the house and the moments their bodies were recovered. This reduction is not intentional cruelty. It is a byproduct of the way the justice system and the media operate, The story is built around the offender because the offender provides a narrative spine. But a truth-first telling must resist that. Because these victims were not only people who died. They were people who lived. They had families, even if strained. They had histories. They had habits. They had personalities. They had dignity that did not depend on wealth or stability. They deserved better than to be forgotten twice, once by the system that failed to protect them, and again by the stories that turned their deaths into a backdrop for a villain. This is why it matters, in this kind of manuscript, to keep returning to the victims. The case is not simply a tale of an evil landlady. It is a case study in how society treats certain lives as disposable until death becomes undeniable. Dorothea Puente did not create her victims' vulnerability. She saw it. She used it. And for years, she was able to do so because the world is used to losing people like them. Chapter 18. What can be proven? The public often wants a story to end with certainty. A suspect is caught. A trial is held. A verdict is delivered. The monster is locked away. The page turns, and the world can pretend the danger has been contained as neatly as a book cover. But the truth of Dorothea Puente's case is more complicated than that, because the legal record and the cultural story do not align perfectly. The cultural story wants a single definitive narrative, a killer landlady who murdered all of her boarders and buried them in the yard. The legal record is narrower. It contains what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt, not everything that may have happened. Dorothea Puente was a real historical person with a documented background, including early arrests for fraud. Her relationship with deception and paperwork began long before the boarding house murders and formed part of a lifelong pattern of manipulation. She lived in Sacramento and operated a boarding house on F Street. Multiple bodies were discovered buried on her property. That fact alone is not a rumor or an interpretation. It is a documented outcome of a police search. The remains recovered from her yard became the central physical evidence of the case, transforming disappearances into confirmed deaths. Several of those bodies were identified as people who had lived in her boarding house and who were receiving government benefits. Their disappearances were not merely social. They were connected to financial exploitation, checks cashed, benefits redirected, identities used. Puente was arrested in Los Angeles after leaving Sacramento during the investigation. She was charged in connection with multiple deaths. She went to trial. A jury convicted her of 3 murders. The court sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She died in custody years later. These points are the backbone of what can be proven: existence, property, bodies, identification, arrest, trial, conviction, and sentence. But the record can also support more detail than a simple spine. It supports the existence of a method. The evidence presented at trial, alongside the pattern of victim vulnerability and financial exploitation, supports the conclusion that Puente targeted people who could be controlled. Many of the known victims were elderly, disabled, or otherwise isolated. They were people whose lives could be managed by a landlady who controlled access to their rooms, their mail, and their contact with the outside world. The record supports the presence of sedation in some victims, suggesting that medication was part of the method used to make people helpless before they were killed. The record also supports the presence of repeated deception, forged checks, false identification, and the continued collection of benefits after victims disappeared. This is not a speculative claim. It is a demonstrable pattern tied to the financial components of the case. Together, these facts allow a strong, sober conclusion. Dorothea Puente used her boarding house to gain access to vulnerable adults, exploited their financial entitlements, and killed at least 3 people in a manner the court found provable beyond reasonable doubt, while additional bodies on her property indicated a broader pattern of lethal harm linked to the house. The language at least matters. The legal record does not state she killed only 3. It states the jury convicted her of 3. A conviction is a ceiling only if the evidence suggests there was nothing beyond it. In this case, the physical reality of multiple bodies in the yard makes that impossible to accept as a full accounting of harm. The record supports the conclusion that more than 3 people died in connection with her property and her tenant pool, even if the law did not convict her for each death. However, the record also creates boundaries, and those boundaries must be acknowledged to maintain credibility. The state could not, or did not, secure convictions on every count. The jury deadlocked on some charges. Some suspected victims were never charged as homicides. Some deaths that appear suspicious in hindsight were not legally resolved in the way the public often assumes. This is why it is possible to say with integrity that Puente's house contained multiple victims and that she was convicted of 3 murders, while also acknowledging that the full scope of her offending cannot be compressed into the verdict alone. A truth-first manuscript does not avoid conclusions. It anchors them. The anchored conclusions are these. Dorothea Puente operated a boarding house where multiple vulnerable tenants disappeared. Multiple bodies were found buried on her property. Some victims were identified as her tenants. Evidence showed financial exploitation through benefits and identity use. A jury convicted her of 3 murders. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. These facts are enough to establish her as a serial murderer. They are enough to establish the boarding house as a lethal site. They are enough to establish that the mask of the landlady was not merely a personality trait, but an operational disguise. What they do not establish is a neat total count of victims, a complete timeline for every death, or a fully visible account of how each individual was killed. That is not a failure of storytelling. It is the nature of cases built in secret against people who were already easy to overlook. Chapter 19. What cannot be proven. Certainty is seductive. It feels like safety. It feels like control. It feels like the story has been contained and the danger has been measured. In true crime, certainty often takes the form of a number, a total count of victims, or a dramatic scene that explains everything at once. People want the case to end with a clear tally, a clear motive, a clear portrait of evil. Dorothea Puente's case does not offer that. It offers something more realistic and in many ways, more unsettling, a pattern that can be proven in parts, and a larger shadow that resists complete accounting. This is not because nothing can be known. It is because some things cannot be proven to the level of certainty modern readers instinctively demand. The first boundary is the victim total. The public narrative often speaks in definitive numbers: she killed this many, she killed that many. Those numbers vary depending on the telling. Some accounts compress suspected victims into confirmed ones. Some count bodies found. Some count disappearances. Some mix the legal verdict with the broader pattern and present it as one solid fact. The truth is that there is no single universally agreed number of victims that can be stated as proven beyond dispute. Bodies were found on Puente's property. Several were identified. Puente was convicted of 3 murders. But beyond the convictions, the legal system did not deliver a complete tally. Some charges ended in deadlock. Some suspected victims were never charged as murders. Some deaths connected to her orbit remain debated and unresolved in a courtroom sense. A total number can be suggested. It cannot be proven as cleanly as the public often wants. The second boundary is the exact timeline of every death. Some victims can be anchored to specific windows because their benefits were cashed after their last confirmed contact, because relatives remembered a final phone call, because a date exists for when they moved into the boarding house, because a room was cleaned abruptly, because paperwork shifted, because they missed an appointment. But other victims, particularly those who were already living with instability, are harder to place precisely. A vulnerable adult may not have a tight chain of witnesses. They may not have a predictable routine. Their last confirmed sighting may be vague. In such cases, the exact moment of death can become difficult to define. This matters because without a firm timeline, proving responsibility becomes harder. A defense can exploit uncertainty. A jury can hesitate. A prosecution can choose not to pursue a charge. That does not mean the death did not occur in the way suspicion suggests. It means the courtroom cannot always say so definitively. The third boundary is the specific method of killing in every case. The record supports sedation in some victims. It supports financial exploitation. It supports concealment in the yard. But not every death can be reconstructed with complete clarity. Burial alters remains. Time alters remains. Evidence decays. What was done inside private rooms is often invisible unless there are witnesses, confessions, or forensic certainty strong enough to withstand challenge. The public often wants a single method, a signature, because it makes the offender feel knowable. In reality, offenders may vary their methods, or evidence may fail to preserve the method clearly. The record can suggest patterns. It cannot always reconstruct every act. The fourth boundary is the full internal mechanics of the house. Who saw what and when? Which tenants noticed which disappearances? How often did outsiders enter the property? Who might have helped? These questions are part of the darker speculation surrounding the case, and they are tempting because they offer drama. But the truth is that the interior life of the boarding house is only partially visible. Tenants were vulnerable, sometimes frightened, sometimes unreliable witnesses, sometimes unwilling to speak. Some may have been manipulated. Some may have been intimidated. Some may have been too damaged by their own circumstances to be treated as ideal witnesses by prosecutors. This is one of the cruelties of targeting vulnerable victims. Even those who survive may not be believed. The house functioned as a closed environment. The landlady controlled narrative. The landlady could isolate tenants from each other and from outsiders. The landlady could make a disappearance look like ordinary turnover. The result is that the full internal mechanics, the daily interplay of fear, control, compliance, and observation, cannot be known in complete detail. The record gives fragments. It does not give the whole interior. The fifth boundary is motive, in its deeper form. Money was a clear part of the case. Financial exploitation can be documented. It is visible in paperwork and in the flow of benefits. But motive is not only about what a person gains. It is also about what a person enjoys, what a person believes they are entitled to, and what psychological need is being met by repeated harm. The deeper motive, the internal satisfaction of control, the potential pleasure of domination, the emotional pattern that made repeated killing possible, cannot be proven in a courtroom sense. There is no file that contains an offender's full interior truth. There is only behavior, and behavior can be interpreted but not fully known. The public often wants a monster with a simple motive. The record offers a human being whose internal landscape is still partly concealed. The sixth boundary is the difference between legal truth and lived truth. A conviction is not always a full accounting of harm. It is a statement of what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt in the specific counts presented at trial. It is possible, and in cases like this, likely, that the legal truth is smaller than the lived truth. This is why people continue to debate Puente's full victim list. The pattern suggests more. The yard suggests more. The timeline suggests more. But suggestion is not proof. That boundary is uncomfortable, yet it must be honored in a truth-first manuscript. Finally, there is the cultural boundary, the difference between what happened and what the world made of it. When the case became public, certain details became magnified because they were vivid. The yard. The shed. The idea of an older woman burying tenants. The death house framing. Over time, these details became almost mythic. They were repeated so often that they hardened into an archetype. But archetypes flatten reality. They turn victims into props and offenders into caricatures. They make the case feel like a Gothic fable rather than a real pattern of harm enabled by social neglect. What cannot be proven, then, is the neat, complete story people want to tell. The record does not give perfect closure. It gives a confirmed crime site, confirmed deaths, a convicted offender, and a larger shadow of harm that cannot be fully measured. In many ways, that shadow is the most frightening part. Because it suggests not only what Puente did, but what she may have been able to do without being stopped, and it suggests that similar harm can occur wherever vulnerable lives can be controlled without scrutiny. Chapter 20. The house as a method. A house is not only a setting. In certain cases, it becomes the method. This is what makes Dorothea Puente's story so chilling. The boarding house on F Street was not merely the place where her crimes occurred. It was a structure designed to deliver her the things she needed: access, control, and plausible disappearance. It allowed her to operate for years without drawing the kind of attention that typically interrupts violence. The house was not incidental. It was the engine. In true crime, method is often discussed in terms of weapons: knives, poisons, guns, strangulation, blunt force. But method can also be architectural. It can be social. It can be bureaucratic. A predator who understands people does not always need a weapon. They need an environment in which a weapon is unnecessary. A boarding house provides such an environment. It gathers vulnerable adults in one place, under the authority of one person, in conditions that outsiders are reluctant to interfere with. It normalizes turnover. It explains instability. It turns privacy into a shield. It offers a structure that can be described as help, while functioning as control. Puente did not need to abduct victims because they came to her. They arrived willingly, not because they were foolish, but because they needed what she promised. A room. Stability. A place to sleep. A place where someone would, supposedly, look after them. In this way, the boarding house removed the most dangerous part of predatory crime, public contact. Everything happened behind a door. This is the first reason the house becomes method: it eliminates witnesses. Public violence is risky. Private violence is not. In a private house, the offender can decide who sees what, who hears what, and who is allowed to speak. A boarding house is private property, but it is also semi-public. People come and go. Tenants are not family. That produces a strange blend of visibility and invisibility. Enough movement to look normal, enough privacy to conceal harm. It is the perfect arrangement for a predator. The second reason the house becomes method is control of narrative. In a typical rental arrangement, a tenant has autonomy. They come and go. They have visitors. They have family. They have the ability to leave without someone watching. But a boarding house, especially one catering to vulnerable adults, functions differently. The landlady often exerts daily authority: rules about meals, rules about behaviour, rules about cleanliness, rules about guests. This authority can be justified as maintaining order, especially when tenants are struggling. The rules can look reasonable. That is precisely why they are dangerous. If a tenant has visitors, the landlady can claim they are disruptive. If family wants to see a tenant, the landlady can say the tenant is unwell, asleep, out, or unwilling. If a tenant complains, the landlady can frame them as unstable. If agencies inquire, the landlady can speak as though she is dealing with chaos. She can sound like the reasonable one. The house therefore becomes a narrative filter. Outsiders do not see tenants directly. They see them through the landlady's explanation. Puente exploited this. The third reason the house becomes method is bureaucratic access. Vulnerable tenants often need help managing money, medication, and appointments. Even when they are capable, their lives can be difficult enough that they accept assistance. A landlady who helps becomes a gatekeeper not only of space, but of identity. She handles mail. She handles checks. She handles paperwork. She knows social security numbers. She knows caseworker names. She knows medical details. She knows enough to steal. This is where the method becomes almost administrative. A person can be murdered, and the system will still pay them. Not because the system is evil, but because it is not designed to detect death quickly in marginal lives. It is designed to process payments unless something triggers intervention. Puente's house became the place where those payments could continue to arrive, and where she could continue to cash them. The house therefore became a financial machine. It was not only a place of death. It was a place where death could be profitable. The fourth reason the house becomes method is social invisibility. A boarding house full of poor, elderly, or disabled tenants does not command cultural interest. It exists on the edge of neighborhood awareness. People might find it unpleasant. They might avoid it. They might speak about it in vague terms: that place, those people, that lady. Avoidance becomes a kind of permission. A predator thrives in places people avoid looking at closely. The fifth reason the house becomes method is the way it exploits assumptions about disappearance. If a middle-class professional goes missing, the assumption is danger. If a vulnerable adult goes missing, the assumption is instability. This difference is not based on evidence. It is based on social bias. The same disappearance is treated differently depending on who the missing person is. Puente's victims were people the world was used to losing. She did not need to create plausibility. She stepped into an existing plausibility and used it. The sixth reason the house becomes method is the way it dilutes responsibility. A boarding house contains many people. It can be noisy. It can have arguments. It can have visitors. It can have tenants who come and go. This creates a fog in which an offender can hide. If something feels wrong, a neighbor might shrug and assume it is just the usual chaos. If a tenant complains, others may assume they are paranoid. If an agency hears something concerning, it may file it as another difficult case. Chaos is protective. Puente's house was not necessarily chaotic in the way it was portrayed, but it existed in a social category where chaos is assumed. That assumption alone provided cover. The seventh reason the house becomes method is the yard. A body hidden in a backyard is not only concealed. It is domesticized. The offender continues to live above it, walk above it, host people above it, cook above it, collect mail above it. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of serial offending committed inside a home. It requires a psychological separation, the ability to treat the dead not as humans, but as objects that can be stored. It also requires confidence, the belief that the world will not dig. Puente believed the world would not dig. For years, she was right. When the house becomes method, it reveals a truth broader than one offender. It reveals how predators can operate successfully not through brilliance, but through alignment with social neglect. Puente did not need to outsmart the state in a spectacular way. She needed the state to be what it already was, overworked, slow, and trained to interpret vulnerable lives as unstable rather than endangered. She needed neighbors to do what neighbors often do, avoid discomfort. She needed families to be strained. She needed victims to be isolated. The house gave her a place where all those conditions could converge. This is why the case matters beyond Puente herself. Because a boarding house is not unique. Vulnerable adults still rely on informal housing. Benefit systems still run on paperwork and delayed detection. Caretaking roles are still trusted by default. And society is still comfortable losing certain people quietly. The house on F Street became lethal because it was built from ordinary structures: housing need, social services, poverty, disability, isolation, and the human desire to believe that an older woman offering help is harmless. The house was the method. And the method, if left unexamined, can exist anywhere. Conclusion: the woman and the house. A house remains when the story ends. Trials conclude. Headlines fade. The offender is sentenced, moved behind walls, reduced to an inmate number and a date of death. The public turns its attention to the next case, the next spectacle, the next monster. But the physical space persists, and with it persists the uncomfortable truth that what happened there was not supernatural, not a one-time rupture in reality, but the predictable result of vulnerability meeting control. The house on F Street did not invent Dorothea Puente. It enabled her. It gave her the role she needed: landlady, caretaker, helper, a role that sounded domestic rather than powerful. It gave her access to people whose lives were already fragile. It gave her proximity, privacy, and the appearance of legitimacy. It allowed her to collect not only rent and benefits, but trust. And it allowed her to do these things without the kind of scrutiny that would have followed if her tenants had been wealthier, younger, more socially protected, or more visible to the world. Dorothea Puente became infamous not only because she murdered, but because she murdered in a way that felt like a violation of the basic order people rely on. A home should be safe. An older woman should be safe. Caretaking should be safe. The case became a cultural obsession because it collapsed those assumptions. It forced the public to confront the idea that danger does not always arrive with obvious menace. Sometimes it arrives in slippers, speaking softly, offering a meal, managing the mail. Sometimes it arrives in the form of someone the world has been trained to trust. That is why the story endured. But the danger in treating Puente as a monster is that monsters allow society to avoid responsibility. A monster narrative suggests an anomaly, a singular evil that appeared out of nowhere, committed unthinkable acts, and was removed. It reassures the public that safety has been restored because the monster has been caged. It implies that such crimes are rare, inexplicable, and therefore unrepeatable unless another monster appears. The record suggests something far less comforting. Puente was able to do what she did because the world around her contained gaps wide enough to swallow people. Those gaps were not created by Dorothea Puente. They existed before her. They exist after her. They are made from poverty, from disability, from addiction, from mental illness, from isolation, from systems that operate on paperwork and delayed detection, from communities trained to avert their eyes from places that feel uncomfortable, from the quiet social truth that some lives are monitored closely and some are not. Puente's victims were not targeted because they lacked worth. They were targeted because the world did not shield them. That is the difference between blame and responsibility. The victims were never responsible for what happened to them. The responsibility sits with the offender, and it also sits with the systems that made certain people easy to take. This does not mean the world wanted them dead. It means the world did not notice them alive. A truth-first telling must also acknowledge the limitations of what can be known. The legal record does not provide complete closure. Puente was convicted of 3 murders, and she was sentenced to life without parole. Multiple bodies were found on her property. Beyond that, the full scope of harm remains difficult to measure with the clean certainty the public often seeks. This uncertainty is not a failure of the story. It is part of the horror. Because it reveals how effectively murder can hide when victims are vulnerable and when evidence is buried both literally and socially. In the years after her conviction, Dorothea Puente became a cautionary figure. The story was repeated in documentaries, articles, books, and late-night conversations. Her name became shorthand for the killer landlady, the death house, the older woman who preyed upon the forgotten. Yet what should endure is not the fascination with her. What should endure is the warning. The warning is not simply that predators can wear friendly faces. The warning is that predators seek environments where their victims will not be missed quickly. The house on F Street was one such environment. It was not unique. It was only visible because the earth eventually gave the dead back. There is another kind of concluding truth that sits beneath the headlines. Even after the case became famous, the house remained a house. It existed within a city that continued to move. People drove past. People lived nearby. The property's physical structure could be changed, sold, renovated, repurposed. The world can repaint walls, replace carpets, and grow new grass over disturbed ground. But no renovation can erase what the house revealed. It revealed that danger is not always loud. It revealed that care can be used as camouflage. It revealed that bureaucratic systems can continue paying for lives that have already been taken. It revealed that the vulnerable can be disappeared not only by a murderer's hand, but by the world's willingness to accept their disappearance as normal. That is why this story matters beyond one woman. Because Dorothea Puente was not a vampire and not a ghost. She did not need the supernatural. She operated within the real, ordinary structures of society, and she succeeded for years because those structures were built to manage vulnerability, not necessarily to protect it. When the final headlines faded, Puente remained what the record states she was, a convicted murderer sentenced to die in prison. But the victims remained something more important. They remained proof that the forgotten can be harmed most easily. They remained proof that safety is not evenly distributed. They remained proof that a person can vanish in plain sight, repeatedly, until the ground itself becomes the witness. And the house remained a reminder that the most frightening stories are not the ones that require myth. They are the ones that could happen again, anywhere society allows certain lives to be treated as disposable, and certain places to exist without being looked at closely. The story ends, but the warning does not. Not until the forgotten are no longer so easy to lose. Bibliography. California Digital Library. The People vs. Dorothea Montalvo Puente Criminal Case Records, 1938 to 2001, bulk 1982 to 1992. Online Archive of California. Accessed January 9, 2026. United Press International, UPI. Sacramento landlady gets life for murders. UPI Archives, December 10, 1993. United Press International, UPI. Puente to get life sentence. UPI Archives, October 13, 1993. The Press Democrat. Sacramento killings landlady held in L.A. November 17, 1988. California Digital Newspaper Collection. The Press Democrat. Dorothea Puente sentenced to life in prison without parole. December 11, 1993. California Digital Newspaper Collection. The Desert Sun Puente Arrest Interview / Identity Details. November 19, 1988. California Digital Newspaper Collection. CBS Sacramento. Dorothea Puente, 82, dies in prison. March 2011. Wikipedia contributors. Dorothea Puente. Wikipedia. Accessed January 9, 2026. Shears, Julia. Dorothea Puente, Killing for Profit. Crime Library. Accessed January 9, 2026. People Magazine. Sweet Grandma with a Sinister Secret, How Dorothea Puente Turned Her Boarding House into a House of Horrors. People, 2024. Murderpedia. Dorothea Puente, Victims. Accessed January 9, 2026. Stone, Michael H., and Gary Brucato. The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. Amherst, New York, Prometheus Books,